Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. Hospitals have always unsettled me. There's something about the sterile white walls, the artificial lighting, and the faint smell of antiseptic that makes my skin crawl. But I never thought much of it, just a natural discomfort, the kind most people feel when they step inside a place where life and death constantly battle for dominance. I used to work as a night security guard at an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. It wasn't my first choice, but the pay was decent, and I needed the money. The building had been shut down for years, left to decay after the city deemed it unsafe for patients. Yet, for some reason, they still needed someone to patrol the premises, making sure no one broke in, vandals, squatters, or thrill-seekers looking for a cheap scare. I wasn't alone in this job. My coworker, a guy about my age, worked the opposite shifts, covering the early mornings while I took over at dusk. We'd cross paths sometimes, exchanging nods and quick conversations before one of us clocked out. Other than that, my only company was the endless silence of the building, broken occasionally by the wind rattling against broken windows. Every night, my routine was the same. I'd arrive around 7 p.m., grab a flashlight from the security office, and do my first patrol. The building had 3 floors and a basement. Most of my rounds were spent walking through the hallways, shining my light into empty rooms, making sure no one had slipped inside unnoticed. It wasn't a hard job. It should have been easy. And yet, from the very first night, something about the place unsettled me. The air inside was heavier than it should have been, thick with something I couldn't quite describe. Even in the dead of summer, the temperature inside was always just a little too cold, the kind of chill that crept beneath my skin and settled in my bones. At first, I chalked it up to my own nerves. A big, empty building at night? Of course, it was eerie. Of course, my mind would play tricks on me. But the longer I worked there, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that I was never truly alone. There were nights when I'd be walking down a hallway and swear I heard footsteps behind me. Not the echo of my own, something separate. Slow, deliberate steps, just a few paces behind. Every time I turned around, the hallway would be empty. Other times, it'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, just a flicker, like someone stepping out of view. But whenever I shined my flashlight toward the source, there'd be nothing there. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. That worked for a while. Until the night I heard the breathing. It was late, sometime after midnight, when I stopped in the old maternity ward to check the doors. Most of the rooms were still intact, though everything inside had been stripped away long ago. No beds, no equipment, just empty spaces where life once existed. I was about to move on when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic breathing. Not my own. I froze, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper of air. But then it grew louder, closer, like someone standing just a few feet away, breathing steadily in the darkness. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction. Nothing, just an empty hallway stretching into the void. The breathing stopped. For a long moment, I stood there, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, just as I convinced myself I'd imagined it, something else happened. The door at the end of the hall, a door I knew was locked, slowly creaked open. I didn't wait to find out why. I turned on my heel and left. That night, I sat in the security office for the rest of my shift, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. I told myself it was the wind, a draft moving through the building. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. But after that night, things started to change. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was no longer just an occasional chill down my spine. It became a constant presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on me as I walked through the halls. I started hearing more noises, faint whispers, impossible to make out, the shuffle of feet in empty rooms. Doors that I knew were closed would be slightly ajar when I passed by again. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Then I saw it. It was my third week on the job. Another slow, uneventful night, at least. That's what I thought. I had just finished checking the second floor and was making my way down the stairs to the first when my flashlight flickered. I stopped, tapping it against my palm, and the light steadied. Just faulty batteries. That's when I heard the sound. A soft creak, like weight shifting on old floorboards. I instinctively held my breath, straining to listen. It had come from the hallway just beyond the stairwell, near the old emergency room. I slowly stepped forward, shining my flashlight down the corridor. Nothing. Just rows of empty rooms, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. I exhaled, shaking my head at myself. I was getting too worked up. Then, just as I turned to head back to the security office, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow! It flickered across the far end of the hallway, just for a second. Too quick to be my own. I whipped my flashlight in that direction. The hallway was empty. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs. Hello? My own voice sounded weak in the silence. No answer. The air felt heavier, pressing against my skin. I took a step forward, then another, forcing myself toward the end of the hallway where I'd seen the movement. My fingers were tight around the flashlight, my grip slick with sweat. I reached the last doorway and hesitated. The room beyond was dark, but my flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating peeling paint and an old hospital gurney shoved against the far wall. Empty. I let out a breath, shaking my head. But just as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The gurney had moved. It was subtle, just a few inches, but I was sure of it. I had seen it against the wall when I first stepped in. Now, there was a sliver of space between it and the tiles. I swallowed hard, taking a slow step back. Then the air changed. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath in front of me. And then I heard it. The breathing. Soft, steady, right behind me. I spun around, shining my light wildly. The hallway was empty. The breathing stopped. I stood there, my chest rising and falling too quickly, every muscle in my body locked up. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I knew I wasn't alone. I backed away, forcing myself to turn and walk down the hallway. I didn't run. I wanted to. Every part of me screamed to sprint out of that place, but I couldn't. I didn't want whatever was in there to chase me. When I made it back to the security office, I locked the door. For the rest of the night, I didn't move. I just sat there, my flashlight clutched in my hands, staring at the monitors. Nothing happened after that, but I didn't relax. Because for the first time, I realized something. The cameras had a blind spot, and the place where I had seen the shadow, it was right in the middle of it. After that night, my shifts at the hospital were no longer just about patrolling an abandoned building. They became about survival. I started dreading the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, when I had to clock in and step into that place again. The hours stretched endlessly, each one heavier than the last. My body was always tense, every muscle coiled tight like a spring, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And it did. Night after night, the incidents grew worse. The first was small, almost dismissible. I had just started my usual rounds, moving through the first floor when I heard it, a door clicking shut somewhere down the hall. It was soft, barely more than a whisper of sound, but it wasn't the wind. I stopped, flashlight steady, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was just the air pressure shifting in the building. But then it happened again. Click. Soft. Deliberate. This time, I turned fast, sweeping my light down the corridor. All the doors were still, except one, just slightly ajar when it hadn't been before. I moved toward it, my footsteps slow and measured. The air felt thick around me, pressing against my skin like something unseen was standing too close. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the smell inside was overwhelming. Stale, suffocating, rotting, like something had died in there and never been cleaned out. I gagged, backing away. The moment I stepped out, the door slammed shut behind me. I ran. I didn't care how it looked. I sprinted back to the security office, locked the door, and stayed there until morning. The next night, the voices started. I was walking past the old operating rooms, flashlight flickering slightly, something it had never done before, when I heard it. A whisper, low, incoherent. It was close. Too close. I stopped cold, straining to listen. My own breathing sounded too loud in the silence. The whisper came again, a few feet away. Then another, and another. They weren't speaking any language I could understand, but they were talking. I turned slowly, scanning the hallway. My flashlight beam landed on an empty gurney in the middle of the corridor. And then it moved. Just a few inches. I froze. Then, from behind me, right next to my ear, I heard something. One word. A low, rasping leave. I spun so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight. No one was there. The air was thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. My skin prickled, the fine hairs on my arms standing on end. I ran again. By the fourth week, I was barely sleeping. Every shift brought something new. Doors slamming on their own. The elevator, which had no power, randomly dinging on different floors. And the shadow. The one I had seen that first night. It wasn't just a flicker in my peripheral vision anymore. It was getting closer. One night, I saw it standing at the far end of the hallway, perfectly still. It wasn't just darkness. It had shape, the vague outline of a person. But something about it was wrong. The proportions weren't right. The arms were too long. The head tilted at an unnatural angle. I stepped forward. It didn't move. But the air around me grew suffocating. I blinked, and it was suddenly closer. I stumbled back, heart hammering. I blinked again. It was closer still. The flashlight in my hands flickered, and for a brief second, the entire hallway was plunged into darkness. When the light steadied, the shadow was gone. But I felt it, standing right behind me. I didn't turn. I just walked, slowly, and as I did, I heard footsteps. Not mine. Something else. Following me. Step. 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 I reached the security office and slammed the door shut, locking it. For the rest of the night, I sat in the chair, staring at the monitors. I told myself I would look away, that as long as I watched the screens, nothing could happen. But at 3:12 a.m., every single camera feed cut to static. The sound filled the room, a harsh, grating noise that made my skin crawl. Then, slowly, the static started to clear. One by one, the feeds came back. And on the monitor that showed the first floor hallway, I saw something. Something standing just outside the security office. Tall, still, waiting. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared. And then, it tilted its head, like it knew I was watching. And then, the feed cut out again. I didn't sleep at all after that shift. The next day, I went online and started looking up everything I could about the hospital. I needed answers. I found out it had been shut down after a fire. An electrical short had sparked in the basement, spreading quickly through the building. Most of the patients had been evacuated, but not all. Some had never made it out, especially those in the psychiatric ward, the third floor, where I had never dared to go. The next night, I made a decision. I had to know what was up there. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So at 2 o'clock, I took my flashlight and went to the third floor. The second I stepped onto that level, everything felt different. The air was wrong. The silence was deafening. The walls were scorched in places, blackened by fire damage. The doors to the patient rooms were all locked, rusted shut. All except one. The door at the very end of the hallway. Slightly open. Waiting. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. The closer I got, the colder it became. My breath clouded in the air. I reached the doorway, lifted my flashlight, and shined it inside. The room was empty. Just a single, rusted hospital bed positioned beneath a shattered window. I exhaled slowly. Nothing was here. Then I turned, and something was standing in the hallway. I didn't hear it move. I didn't hear it arrive. It was just there. Close. Closer than it had ever been before. And this time I saw it clearly. The face, wrong. The mouth stretched too wide. The eyes, hollow pits of darkness. The moment its hand reached for me, my body finally obeyed the panic screaming through my veins. I stumbled back, crashing into the rusted bed frame behind me, sending a deafening clang echoing through the room. My flashlight slipped from my grip, rolling across the floor and casting wild, erratic beams of light against the decayed walls. For a split second, in the chaotic flashes of my failing light, I saw it clearly. The thing standing before me wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't a ghostly silhouette. It was tangible, real. Its skin was blackened and peeling, like it had been burned beyond recognition. Its mouth, far too wide for any human face, twisted into something between a grin and a grimace, as if it were permanently frozen in a scream it had long since lost the ability to release. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was its eyes. Or rather, where its eyes should have been. Two hollow sockets stared at me, black and endless, like they were absorbing the weak light in the room rather than reflecting it. And then it moved. Fast. It lunged, its arms stretching in unnatural, jerking motions. I barely had time to react before I threw myself to the side, landing hard on my hands and knees. A searing pain shot through my palms as they scraped against the debris-covered floor, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted toward the door. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. I didn't stop running. The hallway stretched before me, endless and dim, the emergency lights flickering like dying stars. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as I sprinted toward the stairwell. Something was behind me. I could hear it. A dragging, scraping sound, as if it was pulling itself forward rather than walking. Then, a whisper. Soft, almost gentle, spoken directly into my ear. You shouldn't be here. Ice flooded my veins. My legs nearly gave out beneath me, but I forced myself forward. I reached the stairwell door, slammed my entire body against it, and shoved it open. The metal hinges groaned in protest as I stumbled inside, gripping the railing for support. My vision blurred, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to break free from my chest. And then, I made the mistake of looking back. The hallway was empty. There was nothing there. But I knew it was. I felt it. It was watching me, waiting, toying with me. And then, from the shadows of the hallway, I saw something. A shape. No, multiple shapes. Figures emerging from the darkness, their bodies flickering like distorted projections. And they were all watching me. Their mouths were moving, whispering, chanting in a language I didn't understand. I turned and ran down the stairs, my feet slamming against each step, my breath coming in frantic gasps. I reached the second floor, then the first, then the basement. For some reason, my legs stopped moving. My body locked up, frozen in place, as if something was commanding me to go down instead of up. The air around me grew heavier. The whispers increased. And then, just like before, my flashlight flickered and died. For a moment, I was submerged in total darkness. And then, a light. A faint orange glow flickering at the bottom of the basement stairs. Like fire. And suddenly, I understood. The hospital fire. The one I had read about. The one that had killed the patients who were never evacuated. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an electrical malfunction. It was deliberate. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. The hospital hadn't just left those patients behind. They had been locked in, burned alive. And whatever was down there, whatever was haunting this place, was one of them. I gritted my teeth, shaking my head, trying to fight off the overwhelming sense of pulling. Like something was trying to drag me down, step by step, into the very place it had died. I forced myself to move. Up, not down. I gripped the railing with everything I had and practically hauled myself up the last flight of stairs, crashing through the door into the first floor hallway. The air felt different here. It was still wrong, still tainted by whatever unnatural force clung to the building, but it wasn't as thick. Like it couldn't reach me as strongly up here, or like it was letting me go. I didn't question it. I ran. Through the halls, past the gurneys, past the abandoned rooms where I knew they were still watching. I ran through the front lobby, shoved open the doors, and finally, gasped in the fresh, icy air of the outside world. The moment I stepped out, everything behind me fell silent. No whispers, no dragging sounds, no flickering lights. Just the dark, empty hospital looming behind me like a grave. I didn't look back. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car, practically throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. My breathing was erratic, my entire body drenched in cold sweat. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to believe that by stepping outside, I had escaped whatever was in there. But then, as I looked up at the rearview mirror, I saw it. A reflection that wasn't mine. Sitting in the back seat. Smiling. The last thing I remember before my vision went black was its voice, whispering one final time. You let us out. And then I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. My body was frozen, but my mind was screaming. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It sat in the back seat, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its grin stretching far too wide for any human face. Empty sockets stared into mine, as if it could see directly into me. Then, it blinked. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. My vision blurred, my heart hammering so violently in my chest that I thought it might stop altogether. I turned around so fast that I nearly wrenched my neck, but the back seat was empty. There was no one there. No burned figure. No hollow-eyed thing. Just silence. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. My mind was struggling to make sense of what I had seen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe my own panic had conjured something that wasn't there. But I knew. I knew what I had seen. Something had been in that car with me. And maybe it still was. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it so hard I nearly snapped it off. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the misty night. My shaking hands slammed the gear into reverse, and I peeled out of the hospital parking lot so fast that my tires screeched against the pavement. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I just drove. Mile after mile, my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline, my eyes locked on the road ahead. The highway was eerily empty, not a single other car in sight. The darkness felt endless, stretching out on either side of me, pressing in like a living thing. Every now and then, it glanced at the rearview mirror. And each time, my stomach clenched. Because I swore that I caught the briefest glimpse of movement. Something shifting in the shadows of the back seat. something that shouldn't be there. I drove for hours, long past the city limits, long past any sense of direction. I just needed to get as far away as possible. But no matter how far I went, the feeling never left. That heavy, suffocating presence. Like I wasn't alone. Like something had latched onto me. And then, my phone rang. The sudden noise nearly made me veer off the road. My hand shot to my pocket, fingers trembling as I pulled it out. No caller ID. The screen was glitching, flickering with static. I hesitated. And then, against every instinct screaming at me not to, I answered. I pressed the phone to my ear. And all I heard was breathing. Slow, shallow, right next to my ear. Then, you let us out. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching against the asphalt, my entire body lurching forward as I barely avoided veering off the road. My phone slipped from my hand, landing face down on the passenger seat. The call had ended, but the static was still coming from the speaker. I couldn't breathe. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. My head was spinning, my skin drenched in sweat. And then, in the silence, a single breath. Not mine. Behind me. I didn't wait. I flung open the car door and ran. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I kept going. I had no idea where I was, no idea where I was heading. I just needed to get away. Somewhere in the distance, I saw lights. A gas station, its neon sign flickering. I sprinted toward it, nearly collapsing as I burst through the doors. The cashier, an older man with tired eyes, looked up in shock. I must have looked insane, drenched in sweat, eyes wild, chest heaving. He opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off. Is there anyone behind me? I choked out. He frowned, stepping forward slightly. His gaze flicked past me toward the glass doors. His face paled. His eyes went wide. And then, in the most terrified whisper I've ever heard, he said, "You need to leave. Now." My stomach dropped. I don't understand," I stammered. He shook his head, his hands trembling. "They followed you." I turned. The parking lot was empty, but the gas station's glass doors had fogged over, like someone had been breathing on them. And in the condensation, there was a single handprint, burned into the glass. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the handprint, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The world felt like it was spinning too fast, and I couldn't find my footing. The quiet of the gas station felt suffocating, every second stretching longer than the last. The cashier had backed away, his face pale as he stared at me with an expression of terror that mirrored my own. It took everything I had to tear my eyes away from the glass, to focus on the old man, who was still staring at me, his breath shallow. "You need to go," he repeated, his voice breaking. I don't know what's happening." My voice came out weak, my throat dry. "What is that? Who are they?" His eyes flickered to the door, and then to the empty parking lot, as if he were afraid to even breathe in the same space as me. "They're not from this world," he whispered, barely audible. "They were here long before we were, and once they're aware of you, once they know your name, your face, they'll never leave. You'll never be free." I swallowed, the weight of his words crushing me. "What do you mean, never leave?" The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at the door again, as though he could feel the presence of something unseen. "They followed you from that hospital," he muttered, almost to himself. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." My chest tightened. I could feel the air growing colder, the hairs on my neck standing on end as I realized the truth of what he was saying. It wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't something I could shake off with time. These things had been watching me, waiting, and they weren't going to stop. "Is there anything I can do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. I needed a way out, something, anything that could give me some semblance of control. The man shook his head slowly, his eyes dark with regret. No, not once they've marked you. They're bound to you now. They'll follow you wherever you go. I wanted to scream, to argue, to demand an answer. But I couldn't. The weight of the situation settled over me, suffocating, as the reality of what it brought upon myself began to take hold. There were no answers. There was no escape. All I could do was run. As I turned to leave, a sudden chill washed over me, a cold so intense it cut through the warmth of my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I looked back over my shoulder, heart pounding, only to find the cashier's eyes locked on me with a mixture of fear and pity. "You'll never be alone again," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They'll always be with you." I didn't say another word. I ran out of the gas station, the night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The parking lot was empty, the car still where I had left it. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely get the door open. Once inside, I slammed the door behind me, locking it, as if that would make a difference. I didn't know where to go anymore. I didn't know if it mattered. I drove for hours, trying to outrun the feeling of their eyes on me. I could see their faces in the rearview mirror, hear their breath, feel their presence lingering in the back seat. Every time I looked, there was nothing there. But I knew they were with me. I could never escape. Eventually, I reached a small motel on the edge of town. I didn't care about the room, or the cost, or the rest of the world. I just needed somewhere to be for a while, somewhere that felt safe, even if it wasn't. But I wasn't safe. No matter where I went, no matter how far I traveled, there would always be the same empty face, staring back at me from the shadows. I'll never forget the feeling of that first night after leaving the hospital. The sensation that I wasn't alone, that someone was right there with me. I thought I was losing my mind, but no one would believe me. And I didn't want them to. I didn't want anyone to know the truth, because once you do, once you see them, it's too late. I spent a long time in that motel room, watching the door, the windows, expecting them to show up. They never did, but I knew they were still out there, waiting. A part of me wanted to leave, to flee to a place where they couldn't follow. But deep down, I knew I was already trapped. It was the summer of 1998 when I found myself in a small coastal town, far from the noise and bustle of city life. I was a recent college graduate, eager to escape the pressures of daily life and soak up some quiet time by the sea. The place was serene, untouched by the demands of modernity. I had stumbled upon an old, weathered lighthouse that had been abandoned for decades. Most people thought it was dangerous and unstable, but to me, it held a strange allure. I remember clearly the first time I laid eyes on it. The lighthouse stood tall, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, its white paint chipped and fading from years of neglect. The iron railing surrounding the building had rusted, and the light atop the tower had long since stopped shining. Yet, there was something undeniably captivating about it. The way it stood against the crashing waves, as if guarding the shore, spoke to me in ways I couldn't explain. I wasn't alone during that trip. A few of my friends had decided to join me, seeking a break from their own hectic lives. We were all in our 20s, full of energy and curiosity, eager to explore the small town and enjoy the peace it had to offer. The days were spent wandering through the local shops, sitting by the beach, and enjoying long conversations as the sun set. But we also made it a point to visit the lighthouse, driven by an unspoken fascination. The first few days, It was nothing but a backdrop to our vacation, just another part of the landscape to admire. It wasn't until the fourth day of our stay that things started to feel off. The lighthouse wasn't just an old, abandoned building to us anymore. It had become something else entirely. I can't quite describe the moment when the shift occurred, but there was a certain weight to the air as we approached it one evening. We had been drinking coffee at a small cafe near the shore when we decided to walk up to the lighthouse again. It was nearing dusk, and the sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink. As we climbed the uneven path leading up to the lighthouse, I began to notice a strange chill in the air, though it wasn't particularly cold. We weren't the only ones who felt it. My friends, who had always been the more skeptical ones, seemed to grow uneasy as we neared the tower. "You know," one of them remarked, "this place is kind of creepy." "Yeah, it's always been a little weird," I replied, but I tried to laugh it off. After all, we were just a group of young adults looking for a little adventure, right? But as we approached the lighthouse, the unease only grew stronger. The wind picked up, causing the tall grasses surrounding the lighthouse to sway. The creaking of the metal railing seemed louder than it should have been, as if the structure itself was alive. I could feel my heart rate quicken, and I could see my friends' discomfort in the way they avoided looking directly at the lighthouse. It was as if the building was pulling us in, drawing us closer against our better judgment. We didn't talk much as we reached the base of the lighthouse. It felt as though the silence around us was pressing in, heavier than I had ever felt before. We had planned to climb to the top, but for some reason, none of us were eager to make that final step. Instead, we gathered around the base, staring up at the tower, as if waiting for something to happen. And then, as if on cue, a strange noise broke the silence, almost like a faint scraping sound coming from somewhere high above. I looked at my friends, but no one spoke. We all heard it, but none of us were willing to acknowledge it. The scraping noise continued for a moment, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. That was when I knew something wasn't right. We couldn't stay much longer, but none of us moved. We simply stood there, frozen, as the sky darkened, the lighthouse looming over us like a silent sentinel. Something about the place had changed. It wasn't just the old building that had begun to feel alive. It was the entire atmosphere, as if the air itself had thickened. We didn't talk as we made our way back down the path, but I could feel the tension between us all. The experience had left an uncomfortable mark on us, one we couldn't shake off. It was as if the lighthouse had become something else, a dark presence, an entity that watched us, waiting. That night, none of us slept well. We all tossed and turned in our rooms, our minds fixated on the lighthouse. We had spent our days in the sun and fun, but the shadows of the night had transformed our perception of the place. By morning, we had all agreed that we would visit the lighthouse again the next day, but none of us were enthusiastic about it. Instead, we tried to forget about the feeling of unease that had settled over us. But as it turned out, we couldn't escape it. I'll never forget how that next day unfolded. We set out for another visit to the lighthouse, telling ourselves we would just take a quick look and leave. But as we walked the familiar path, things began to feel different. It wasn't just a sense of unease, it was the sense that something had changed overnight. The lighthouse stood as it always had, but this time there was something in the air, a subtle, unshakable presence that made everything feel wrong. None of us dared to say it out loud, but we all felt it. Whatever had been lingering at the lighthouse had grown stronger. It had become impossible to ignore. The morning after our unsettling visit to the lighthouse, I felt a lingering tension in the air. We tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling ourselves it was nothing more than the power of suggestion. After all, we were just a group of friends on vacation, and it wasn't like anything truly strange had happened. Yet, the weight of the air around us, the way the ocean breeze felt colder than usual, kept gnawing at my mind. We had decided to spend the day exploring the coastline and not to visit the lighthouse. That was until, on a whim, we found ourselves walking back up the path leading toward it later that afternoon. There was something almost magnetic about the lighthouse now. It was as if we couldn't stay away, even though a part of us wanted to. We had all agreed not to bring it up, what we'd heard, what we'd felt the day before. But as we walked closer to the lighthouse, it was impossible to ignore the pole. The path leading to it was lined with wildflowers, their colors vibrant under the sun. But even the bright hues felt muted, overshadowed by the oppressive weight in the air. The lighthouse looked exactly as it had the day before, yet somehow it felt different. Standing at the base of it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The wind had picked up, and it seemed to twist in unnatural directions, as if urging us to stay away. One of my friends, a guy I had known since high school, suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint what he was referring to. It was silent, too silent. The usual sounds of seagulls and the waves crashing against the cliffs were gone. In their place was an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice sounding much too loud in the oppressive quiet. He stood there for a moment, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if trying to catch the sound. Then he spoke again, his voice low but urgent. "I thought I heard something, like a footstep or a shuffle. But we're the only ones here, right?" My other friends looked at each other, unease creeping into their expressions. It wasn't that we didn't believe him, it was the way he said it. There was a hesitance in his voice, a certainty that made my heart race faster. Something wasn't right. "I didn't hear anything," I said, trying to sound calm, but even I could sense the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. We decided to continue forward, but this time, no one spoke. The path leading up to the lighthouse had grown steeper, and the sound of our shoes crunching on the gravel seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. With every step, I felt more and more like we were intruding, like the lighthouse didn't want us there. The closer we got, the more I could feel the tension mounting in the air, thick and oppressive. When we reached the door to the lighthouse, it was as if something were pulling us inside. Without even discussing it, we all stood there, looking up at the faded structure, not sure what to do next. The door, once left ajar during our previous visit, was now closed tight, but it wasn't locked. One of my friends, a girl who had been unusually quiet since our last trip up, reached out and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked as it opened, the sound grating against the silence around us. It wasn't the normal kind of creak, it was deep, drawn out, as if the lighthouse itself was protest our presence. Inside, the air was musty, stale with the smell of damp wood and the remnants of old saltwater. It was strange how the lighthouse still smelled of the ocean, even though we hadn't been near the water in hours. But there was something else, a faint but unmistakable odor that I couldn't place. It wasn't just mildew or rot, it was something darker, something that didn't belong. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the air tasted thick, almost suffocating. I heard a sharp intake of breath from behind me and turned around to see my friends' faces pale, their eyes wide with unease. We had entered, but none of us wanted to be there. We had crossed the threshold, and now there was no turning back. The light filtering through the broken windows cast long, ghostly shadows on the floor, and I noticed something odd. In the far corner of the room, near the stairs leading up to the top of the tower, there was a single chair, an old wooden chair. It looked out of place, like it hadn't been touched in years. But the thing that struck me was the fact that the chair was positioned as though someone had been sitting in it recently, facing the stairs. The dust around the chair was disturbed, the marks in the dirt too fresh. The others seemed to notice it at the same time I did. I caught a look of disbelief on their faces, a mix of fear and curiosity. One of my friends stepped forward to inspect the chair, his hand hovering just above it as if afraid to touch it. "This wasn't here yesterday," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "No," I said, feeling my heart pound harder in my chest. "It wasn't." I couldn't stop staring at the chair, my mind racing to make sense of it. We hadn't been inside since our visit a few days ago. No one had been up to the lighthouse, so how was it possible that the chair had been moved? My gaze drifted to the staircase leading to the top. I felt a strange pull toward it, but I didn't want to go up. Not yet. It was then that the sound came again. That same faint, scraping noise. Only this time, it was much louder, much closer. We froze, all of us listening, our breath caught in our throats. The noise seemed to come from above us, from the top of the lighthouse, scraping against the metal like something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the floor. But there was no one up there. We had just opened the door, and we were the only ones in the building. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to find my voice. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but somehow I managed to step forward. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't. Something held me there, paralyzed by the unknown, by the sound that was now growing louder, more distinct. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. We all stood there, unsure of what to do, when a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind us. The sound echoed through the lighthouse, jolting us all into motion. Panic spread across my friends' faces as they turned toward the door, desperately trying to reopen it. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something, or someone, was holding it shut from the outside. That's when I realized it. We were trapped. The door wouldn't budge. Panic swept through all of us like a tidal wave, but no one dared scream. Instead, we stood there in the eerie silence of the lighthouse, breathless and frozen, as if time had suspended itself. I pressed my shoulder against the door and pushed with everything I had, but it didn't move. It was like the lighthouse had become alive, refusing to let us leave. My friend who had tried opening it first cursed under his breath and stepped back. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." The air felt heavier now. It wasn't just the sense of being trapped. There was something more, something sinister. The temperature had dropped, and I could see my breath in front of me, even though we weren't near the ocean anymore. I glanced at my friends, their faces pale, and my heart hammered in my chest. They all looked just as terrified as I felt. "Okay," I finally said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. "We need to find another way out. Let's check the windows." But before we could move, there was a sudden, sharp creak from upstairs. It was a sound so loud, it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, and it made every single one of us flinch. I glanced up at the staircase leading to the lighthouse's upper levels, the darkness above swallowing any sense of clarity. There was no way someone could be up there, was there? "What was that?" one of my friends asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he was just as disturbed as I was. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "But we need to figure out what's going on." Without another word, we began moving toward the stairs. The steps groaned under our weight, each footfall echoing in the thick silence, each one making the atmosphere feel more suffocating. The walls around us were crumbling, their peeling paint and rotting wood only adding to the sense that this place had long since been abandoned by anything remotely alive. The higher we climbed, the colder the air became. There was a dampness that clung to the walls, making my skin feel clammy and slick. It was as though the very air itself was absorbing the moisture, making the whole place feel as if it had been left to rot for decades, even though it couldn't have been. We'd seen the place just a few days ago, and it had been fine. At least it looked fine on the surface. But now, everything about it felt wrong. We reached the top, the stairs creaking louder with each step. My breath came in shallow bursts, my mind racing with theories, each more absurd than the last. I kept wondering if the others felt the same oppressive weight, or if it was just me. At the top of the stairs, we came to a small, open landing. The narrow space was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb overhead. There was a ladder leading to a small attic-like space just beyond the open door, and a broken window that allowed the wind to rush in and stir the old dust on the floor. I could feel the wind now, stronger, colder, as if something was trying to push us back. Then we all heard it again, the dragging sound, louder now, like something heavy scraping against wood. The noise seemed to be coming from the attic, and it was unmistakable. Without a word, we moved closer to the ladder, each of us too afraid to speak. The dragging sound intensified, followed by the faintest clicking noise, like a door opening and closing repeatedly. It was impossible to ignore. There was something up there. "What do you think it is?" one of my friends asked, his voice barely audible, as though he didn't want to hear the answer himself. I couldn't answer him because I didn't know. All I could think about was the chair we had seen downstairs, the one that hadn't been there the day before. The chair facing the stairs, as if someone had been waiting for us. I climbed the ladder first, the rungs slick with grime under my hands. As I reached the top, I paused, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. There was something about this space that felt ancient, as if the very walls held secrets, whispers from decades ago, and all I could do was stand there, waiting to hear them. The others climbed after me, their footsteps hesitant but determined. We all crowded together at the entrance to the attic, our eyes adjusting to the dim light. There was a small window at the far end, its glass cracked, and the remnants of dust and cobwebs clung to everything in sight. But it wasn't the dust or the cobwebs that made my stomach churn. It was the shadows. The corner of the attic was filled with an unsettling blackness, a void so deep it seemed to pull the light away from everything else. It was like a hole in the universe itself, a space that didn't belong. And within it, there was a form, faint, like a silhouette against the darkness, but still there. A figure! I felt my legs go weak as I took a step forward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure moved, a shift in the shadows, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was watching us. Watching me. The others saw it too, their eyes wide with fear, their breaths quick and shallow. "We have to leave. Now," one of them finally whispered. But as we turned to leave, the air grew impossibly thick. The door to the attic slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. We were no longer in control. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, and the darkness seemed to bleed into the room, engulfing everything in its path. The light from the bulb flickered and then died completely, plunging us into absolute blackness. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and then I heard the whisper. A voice, soft and distant at first, but growing clearer. A voice I knew I would never forget. It said only one word. "Leave." The temperature dropped further, and I could feel my skin crawling as if something were crawling beneath it. Panic set in, and we scrambled to the door, our hands shaking as we tried to pry it open. But it wouldn't budge. Then, the scraping noise started again, louder and faster, like something was moving directly behind us. I knew we had to get out before whatever it was caught us. With one last desperate push, the door gave way, and we tumbled out of the attic, down the ladder, and back onto the landing. But we weren't out of danger yet. We didn't stop running. We couldn't. The cold, suffocating air seemed to chase us, pushing us forward with a force we couldn't resist. Each of us was gripped by a primal need to escape the nightmare we'd stumbled into. The walls around us blurred as we sprinted through the lighthouse, our shoes pounding against the floor, but it felt like we weren't getting anywhere. The more we ran, the more it seemed as though the building itself was shifting, stretching, and warping, trapping us in its endless maze. I glanced over my shoulder, heart racing. The shadows were following us, growing longer, darker, more solid. At first, they had just been fleeting shapes, but now they seemed to be taking form, writhing, twisting like some malevolent creature coming to life. The air grew colder with each step, the temperature dropping to the point where I could feel my breath freezing in front of me. My mind was a blur. We couldn't be here anymore. I couldn't even think straight, just the overwhelming need to escape consuming every thought. "We're almost there," one of my friends shouted, his voice tinged with both fear and desperation. But there was no sense of relief in his words. He was only trying to convince himself. None of us believed we were truly safe. The exit, the front door, the only way out, loomed ahead of us. But it felt like it was just beyond our reach. Every time we thought we were closer, it seemed to recede further into the distance. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light, or if the building itself was warping our perception. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs burned, my breath was shallow, and my mind felt like it was fracturing under the weight of what was happening. We had to get out. We had to leave this place. Whatever was chasing us. Whatever was in this lighthouse. It wasn't natural. Then, everything stopped. It wasn't a gradual stop either. One moment, we were running, desperate, and the next, we were standing still, paralyzed in place, as if an invisible force had pressed us into the floor. It wasn't just physical. It was like something in the very air had frozen us in place, trapping us in a state of terrified stillness. I couldn't move. I tried, but it felt as though the very foundation of the lighthouse was holding me down, holding all of us down. There was no sound, no wind, no movement, only the oppressive weight of silence pressing against our ears. And then it came, the voice. It wasn't loud, but it was so unmistakable, so clear, that it made my blood run cold. It wasn't one voice. It was many. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once, all surrounding us, filling the air with their hissing whispers. They didn't say words. They said feelings, threats. The air was thick with hatred, with the desire to see us crumble and fall. Leave! It was the same voice we had heard in the attic. The same word, but this time it was different. It was no longer a warning. It was a demand, a command. I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered so violently that it felt as though it would burst. I could feel the weight of the presence around me, closing in on me, suffocating me, until I thought I would collapse from sheer terror. It wasn't just the voices. The darkness had taken on a form, a shape. The shadows that had been following us were no longer distant shapes. They had manifested into something tangible, something real. It was a figure, a tall, dark figure standing in front of us. I couldn't see it clearly, not entirely, but I could feel it. Its presence filled the room, filling every inch of the space around us. It was as though the very air had thickened, taken on substance. The figure was looming, a black silhouette against the oppressive darkness, its outline jagged and shifting, as though it was made of the shadows themselves. And then it moved. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. It was in front of me in an instant, its cold, invisible breath washing over me. My body shook with fear, and I couldn't make myself move, couldn't escape its gaze. Its presence paralyzed me. And then I saw its face. It wasn't a face, not in the traditional sense. It was a mask, blank, hollow, featureless, yet full of an ancient malice that sent a chill through my very soul. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow, dark voids, like staring into the abyss. I could feel them on me, on each of us, watching us, judging us. One by one, I turned to see the others. They were all staring, eyes wide, faces pale, frozen in terror. But none of them spoke. None of them could speak. We were all caught in its grip, unable to do anything but wait. Then it raised its arm, a long skeletal hand that seemed to stretch into the shadows themselves. It pointed toward the door. Leave, it repeated, its voice echoing in my mind, its words a command that I couldn't ignore, couldn't escape. It was as though my very body was responding to the command. My feet began to move without my will. The others, too, were slowly backing away, their steps hesitant, but driven by some instinctual need to obey. We didn't know what it wanted from us, what it would do if we didn't leave. We didn't care. The terror had us by the throat, choking out any other thought. The only thing we cared about now was surviving. We stumbled toward the door, the shadows in the corners of the room shifting as if they were alive, as if they were trying to stop us. Every step felt like it might be our last. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed in the silence, and we burst out into the night air. But the figure didn't follow. It didn't need to. We knew in that instant that the lighthouse wasn't just a place. It was a presence. A dark, ancient force that had been waiting for something, for someone. And now that it had us, we couldn't escape its grip. We ran into the night, our legs giving out beneath us. But we didn't stop. We didn't look back. And as we reached the edge of the cliff, as the lighthouse disappeared behind us in the distance, we realized one horrifying truth. We hadn't left. It was still with us. Its presence lingered in the air, in the shadows around us, in the silence that followed us wherever we went. The night air was sharp as we ran, our lungs burning with each breath. It felt like the world around us was spinning, like nothing was real anymore. The lighthouse stood in the distance, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight, yet I knew it was still there. The darkness we had left behind felt like it was clinging to us, chasing us. But we couldn't stop. We couldn't stop running, couldn't stop moving forward. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Words felt useless. We had seen things that defied explanation, that twisted the very fabric of our reality. And now, as we fled, we realized that we hadn't escaped it. We had only made it worse. We didn't know how long we had been running. Time had blurred into an endless stream of footsteps and shallow breaths. We didn't even know where we were headed. The world around us was empty, silent, nothing but the stretch of road and the weight of the night. The cold seemed to seep into our bones, making it harder to move, harder to think. But we couldn't stop. Not yet. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the cliff that we finally slowed down. The lighthouse was gone from view, swallowed by the darkness. But we all knew that it was still there, looming in the distance, waiting for us. We had barely made it out. And yet, none of us could shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. The presence, that force, that darkness, had it followed us? "We're not safe," one of my friends whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I couldn't argue with her. The feeling that something was still there, just beyond the edge of our perception, hung over us like a dark cloud. We collapsed onto the cold ground, too exhausted to move, too shaken to think clearly. Our bodies trembled, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from the sheer terror that had consumed us. We had faced something that couldn't be explained, something that had shattered everything we thought we knew about the world. And now, we were left with nothing but questions. "Do you think it's over?" another friend asked. He sounded as lost as I felt. None of us had the answers. None of us could explain what had happened or why it had happened. The things we'd seen, the things we'd felt, none of it made sense. But one thing was certain. We had narrowly escaped something beyond comprehension. The lighthouse, that place of darkness, was still out there. But what if we went back? What if it wasn't finished with us yet? Could we even face it again? We didn't know. None of us did. But something inside of me told me that the worst wasn't over. That feeling, the one that had pressed down on me in the lighthouse, the one that had filled my every thought since, we hadn't escaped it. We had only postponed it. And now, we were left to live with the consequences. We spent the rest of the night in silence, unable to speak, unable to process what had happened. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, haunted by the images of the lighthouse, of the shadows, of that figure. The days that followed were no better. We tried to move on with our lives, to push the memories of that night to the back of our minds. But it didn't work. The feeling of being watched never left. The shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to grow darker, as if they were alive. And every night, when the sun set and the darkness crept in, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse was waiting for us, waiting to claim us. We tried to tell people what had happened, but no one believed us. It sounded too unbelievable. A haunted lighthouse? Shadows that move? It was a story that didn't make sense, a story that no one would believe. And so, we were left alone with our fear, with the knowledge that whatever we had encountered in that lighthouse was still out there, still watching, still waiting. We couldn't forget it. We couldn't move on. One by one, we began to separate. Life went on. But the lingering presence, the sense that we were being hunted, never left us. Some of my friends tried to forget, to pretend it hadn't happened. But I couldn't. Every night, I would wake up, drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers in my ears. The shadows in my room would stretch longer, darker, and I could hear it, the low, resonant hum of something ancient and powerful. I went back to the lighthouse once. I had to know. I had to see it with my own eyes. But when I arrived, it was just a building. Old, worn down, forgotten by time. Nothing moved. There were no shadows, no whispers, no figure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I left before the sun set. I never went back. In the end, we never found answers. We never resolved the question that haunted us all. What was it? What had we encountered that night? It wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was something darker, something older, something that had been waiting for us. And it wasn't finished with us yet. It's been years now, but the memory of that night at the lighthouse still lingers in the back of my mind. No matter how much time passes, no matter how many other experiences I've had, nothing has ever quite been like that night. That darkness, that feeling, it never fully left me. It's one of those things that you can never truly erase, no matter how much you wish you could. Life has a way of moving on, doesn't it? The world keeps turning, and you're left with a choice. You either move forward, or you let the past drag you down. I chose to move forward. I had to. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of that lighthouse forever. But even now, when the night falls and the world grows quiet, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there. Watching. Waiting. What was it? Was it a ghost? A demon? Some force of nature that we could never hope to understand? I don't know. None of us ever did. But I've learned to accept that not every mystery can be solved. Not every question can be answered. Some things, I think, are meant to remain unsolved. There are nights when I'll hear a creak in the floorboards or the soft, eerie sound of wind rattling the windows, and for a moment, they'll freeze. My heart will race, and I'll remember the way the lighthouse felt, how the air inside it was thick with something unspeakable. But then, just as quickly, I'll shake it off. There's nothing there. It's just my mind playing tricks on me. I try to remind myself that what happened at that lighthouse was an isolated incident, that it was a chapter in my life that I can close and move on from. But the truth is, I don't think I'll ever fully shake it. Some people may laugh at me for still thinking about it, for still being haunted by it. But they didn't feel it, did they? They didn't stand in that cold, dusty lighthouse, staring at the shadows that seemed to move on their own, feeling the suffocating weight of an unseen presence. No one but us who were there that night could truly understand. And maybe that's why we all parted ways after. Because once you felt something like that, something beyond explanation, something that twists your very understanding of the world, it changes you. Forever. It's funny, isn't it? How life can feel so normal one minute, and then in the blink of an eye, it can turn into something you never could have prepared for. Something that shakes the very foundation of what you thought was real. But maybe that's what makes us human. We live our lives thinking we know how things work, that we understand the rules of the world. But then something happens, and all that certainty crumbles. We realize that there's so much more to this world than we could ever imagine. Forces we can't see, things we can't explain. Maybe it's the unknown that keeps us up at night. The feeling that, just beyond our grasp, there are things, real things, waiting for us, things that exist outside the realm of our understanding. And in the quiet of the night, when the world feels still and everything seems at peace, that's when we feel it the most. The echo of something lurking just out of sight. In the end, I guess that's the part that haunts me the most. The unanswered questions. The way we left that lighthouse without ever truly understanding what it was, what had happened to us, or what it still wanted. The fear of the unknown, that's the thing that stays with you. Not the ghosts or the shadows, but the thought that maybe, just maybe, there's something out there we'll never fully comprehend. The lighthouse was nothing but an old building, decaying and forgotten by time. But I've come to realize that it wasn't the building that was haunted. It was the land, the place itself. There was something there long before we arrived, something ancient, something powerful. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a spirit. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in our world. And we were foolish to think we could ever understand it. Sometimes, when I pass by the coast, I'll catch a glimpse of the lighthouse in the distance, its dark outline cutting through the horizon. I still get that chill running down my spine, that same sense of dread that I felt all those years ago. I never go near it. I can't, and I don't think I ever will. I've learned to live with the fear, to live with the uncertainty. It's not easy, but it's the price we pay for venturing into the unknown, for seeking answers to questions that were never meant to be asked. And maybe, just maybe, some things are better left forgotten. Some things are better left undisturbed. So here I am, living a life that, on the surface, seems perfectly normal. But every now and then, when the wind howls just a little too loudly, when the shadows seem to stretch just a little too far, I'm reminded of that night. And I wonder, with a sense of unease that I can't shake, if we really escaped at all. The journey was a bit of an adventure itself. The winding roads that led into the mountains felt endless, and the weather turned from sunny to overcast as I got closer to my destination. I was used to traveling alone, so the isolation didn't bother me much. I had the music playing, the windows down, and the wind in my hair. There was something peaceful about being so far away from the usual chaos of city life. When I finally arrived at the hotel, the place looked exactly how I pictured it, old but charming. The building had that vintage feel to it, with its stone walls and ivy crawling up the sides. The large wooden door creaked as I entered, and I was greeted by the hotel receptionist, who seemed almost too eager to hand me the keys. The hotel was quiet, almost eerily so, as if it had been untouched by time. It checked in around dusk, and by the time I was in my room, the sky had darkened. My room was on the second floor, at the end of the hall. The hallway itself was lined with antique pictures that seemed out of place with the modern world outside. The walls were adorned with dark, heavy wood panels, and the air felt slightly cold, even though the temperature outside was mild. I unpacked my bags, setting up my things in the small but comfortable room. The bed was large, covered with a thick quilt, and there was a window overlooking the trees that stretched for miles in every direction. The whole place had a quiet, calm feel to it, the kind of place where you could relax and forget about everything. But there was something about this hotel that seemed off. It wasn't the kind of feeling I was used to when traveling. Usually I would have felt excited or at least comfortable. But here, there was an underlying sense of unease, something I couldn't quite place. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the isolation of being in such a remote location. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar surroundings making me feel a little jumpy. I tried to shake off the weird feeling as I settled in, but the silence in the room felt too heavy. The only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards, as though the building itself was shifting in the dark. At first, everything seemed fine. I watched a movie, then turned off the TV and prepared to sleep. But as I lay there in the stillness of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination playing tricks on me, but the longer I lay there, the more intense the feeling became. It was as if someone, or something, was watching me. The shadows in the room seemed to move when I wasn't looking, and the temperature dropped ever so slightly. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort. The clock on the nightstand ticked loudly in the quiet room, its sound reverberating off the walls. I kept my eyes closed, but my mind raced with thoughts. What if something was wrong with this place? What if I wasn't as alone as I thought? I tried to shake off the thought, turning over to face the window. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was someone walking past, perhaps another guest heading to their room. But the footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I froze, my heart beating faster. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but I heard nothing else. No knock, no words, just an unsettling stillness. I waited for what felt like an eternity, hoping the footsteps would continue down the hall. But instead, the silence remained. The room seemed colder now, and I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed to check. My eyes darted to the door, then to the window. The shadows outside were deeper, more pronounced, as though the night itself had grown darker. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, but the peace was fleeting. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange events of the previous night. Was it just my imagination? Or was there something truly odd about this hotel? The morning after the strange occurrence outside my door, I decided to push the unsettling feeling aside. I convinced myself it was just the nerves that come with being in a new place, far from home, where everything feels unfamiliar. The hotel itself had an odd charm, a feeling of history and age that made everything seem a little more out of place. I took a long shower, dressed, and grabbed a quick breakfast downstairs. The sun was shining now, the mountain air crisp, and I told myself that today would be different. I would explore the area, get some fresh air, and forget about the strange events that happened the night before. As I walked around the grounds, I noticed that the hotel was in an isolated part of the mountains. There were no other buildings for miles, just trees, hills, and a winding road that led to the valley below. It was the perfect setting for anyone who wanted to escape from the world. But something about the isolation also added to the eerie feeling I had. There were no other guests in sight. No one was walking around outside, no sounds of voices or laughter. It was as if the place was abandoned. The receptionist had mentioned that it was a slow time for visitors, but even then, the absence of other people seemed strange. I spent some time walking around the garden, looking at the old trees and the weathered statues that decorated the area. I even took a few pictures to remember the place by, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until later that afternoon that I first noticed something truly odd. I had returned to my room, feeling a little lighter after some time spent in the open air, but the weird feeling still lingered. I placed my things down and sat by the window, looking out over the tree line. The view was beautiful, but it was hard to fully appreciate it when I felt like something was watching me. I pushed the thought aside again, chalking it up to overactive nerves. But then, I saw it. A figure standing just outside the window. It was a fleeting moment, but I saw it clearly enough. A person, or what looked like a person, standing still among the trees. At first, I thought it might have been another guest or a hotel worker. But as I blinked, trying to focus, the figure was gone, disappeared into the shadows. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the empty patch of forest, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I didn't panic, at least not right away. I tried to convince myself that I had just imagined it, that the figure was probably just a trick of the light or a shadow cast by one of the trees. But when I looked at the spot where I had seen the figure, the feeling of unease came rushing back. There was no one there. The trees swayed in the breeze, and the only sound was the occasional chirp of a bird. I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in the trees, motionless. I got up from the window and opened the door to my room, stepping out into the hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked down the long, dimly lit corridor, the only light coming from the flickering bulbs overhead. The silence in the hotel felt almost suffocating now, and the quiet was too deep, too unnatural. I approached the staircase, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall, and descended slowly, trying to calm my nerves. I reached the lobby and found the receptionist sitting at the desk, reading a book. She looked up when I entered, a polite smile on her face. "Everything okay, sir?" she asked, her voice almost too soft. too polite. "Yeah, everything's fine," I replied, trying to mask the unease I was feeling. I just, I thought I saw someone outside my window earlier." The receptionist's expression didn't change. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes distant, before responding. "Ah, the trees do play tricks on you," she said cryptically, almost as if she had said it before. "Sometimes you see shapes out there. The forest is quite deceptive." I nodded, though I didn't quite buy it. The forest had a strange, almost suffocating quality to it, but I wasn't sure if it was the trees or the hotel itself that was causing me to feel this way. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the grounds again, trying to shake off the strange sensation that had settled over me. It was still quiet, too quiet, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see that figure again. But nothing happened for the rest of the day. That night, however, things took another strange turn. I went to bed early, wanting to make sure I was rested for the next day. The room was quiet, the only sound of the soft hum of the air conditioner. I tried to sleep, but once again, that feeling of being watched returned. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my body tense. I knew I shouldn't be so paranoid, but the atmosphere of the place was getting to me. Then I heard a soft knock, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from the door, just outside my room. My heart raced, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. Another knock, louder this time. But when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. I opened the door cautiously, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. The hallway was empty. The lights flickered above me, casting shadows along the walls. There was no sign of anyone, no footsteps, no movement, just silence. I closed the door and locked it quickly, my mind racing. What was going on in this hotel? Was it just my imagination, or was there something more sinister at play? The knocks, the figure in the window, the strange receptionist, everything was adding up to something I couldn't ignore. The rest of the night was filled with restless sleep, and when I woke up the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had to get to the bottom of it. The days that followed grew increasingly unsettling. At first, I tried to rationalize everything. The strange figure I had seen outside the window could have been some trick of the light. The knocking could have been someone else in the hotel, and the eerie silence was probably just a result of the remote location. But as each day passed, the events only intensified, and the sense of dread grew stronger. There was no escaping it anymore. Something was wrong with this place. I spent most of my days trying to keep myself occupied, taking long walks through the surrounding area, hoping that being outside would clear my mind. But the forest had a way of getting under my skin. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches heavy with the weight of something I couldn't quite explain. Even when I stood in the open field beyond the hotel, the feeling of being watched was never far behind. It was as though the very air was charged with an unseen presence, something dark and heavy that lurked just beyond the edge of my vision. It was the third night that things took a turn for the worse. I had returned to my room after dinner and was sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. The night was unusually still, with no sounds of wildlife or wind rustling through the trees. It was as though the entire world had gone silent, leaving me alone in the unnerving stillness. I turned away from the window and walked over to the bed, sitting down and running my hand through my hair, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled over me. But just as I was about to lie down, I heard something soft and faint, almost like a whisper. I froze, straining my ears to catch it. There it was again, just out of reach, like a soft murmur coming from the hallway outside my door. I slowly stood up, my pulse quickening. The door to my room was closed, locked as usual. But the whispering continued, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from just outside the door, as if someone were standing there, speaking in a low, hurried voice. I approached the door cautiously, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but still I couldn't make out the words. I pressed my ear against the door, holding my breath, trying to listen. It sounded like a conversation. But who could it be? No one had knocked. No one had called out. The hotel was nearly empty, and I hadn't seen anyone since breakfast. I hesitated for a moment, then swung the door open. But the hallway outside was empty. There was no one there, no sign of anyone having been near my room. The silence returned, even heavier than before. My mind raced as I stood in the doorway, staring down the dark corridor. The flickering lights overhead cast long, jagged shadows that stretched across the floor and walls. The air felt cold, almost too cold for a summer night. I stepped back inside and closed the door, my heart pounding. The whispering had stopped, but the tension in the room hadn't eased. It felt suffocating now, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name. I stood still for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts, but then I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the other side of the wall, just beyond the head of the bed. I froze in place, my eyes wide, staring at the wall as if expecting something to burst through. But nothing happened. The footsteps continued, dragging along the floor, a constant rhythm that didn't stop. I moved closer to the wall, my breath shallow, listening intently. The footsteps were coming from the room next door, at least, that's what I thought. I knocked on the door to the room next to mine, but there was no answer. The sounds persisted, as if mocking me, but there was no one there. I waited for a response, hoping for some reassurance that the noise was nothing more than an old building settling. But nothing came. By now, I had reached my limit. My curiosity had morphed into something darker, something more urgent. I couldn't let it go anymore. I had to find out what was happening. I made my way down to the hotel's front desk, my feet heavy with dread. The receptionist was still there, sitting behind the counter, reading her book. She didn't even look up when I walked in, her face expressionless, almost too calm. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tight. "I need to know what's going on in this place. There's something strange happening. I've heard whispers, I've heard footsteps, I've seen things I can't explain. What's going on here?" The receptionist didn't respond immediately. She slowly lowered her book and looked up at me, her gaze unsettlingly vacant. "I told you before," she said in her soft, almost monotone voice. "This hotel is old. It has its stories. People see things, hear things. It's part of its charm." Her words made my blood run cold. "No, this isn't charm. This is something else. There's something wrong here." She sighed and stood up from behind the counter. She motioned for me to follow her, and I hesitated before stepping behind the desk and into the narrow hallway that led deeper into the hotel. The air in this part of the building was damp, colder than the rest of the hotel. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes following us as we walked. We stopped in front of a door that I hadn't noticed before. It was unmarked, just a plain wooden door with peeling paint. The receptionist stood in front of it, her hand resting on the doorknob. "This is the room that people talk about," she said, her voice strangely distant. "The room where things happen, where things don't belong." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean? What happens in there?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door, revealing a room that seemed even darker than the hallway. I couldn't see much, but there was something about the space that filled me with a deep sense of dread. I stepped into the room, my feet reluctant to cross the threshold. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and there was an unmistakable chill that settled over me the moment I entered. The walls were bare, save for one large mirror that stood in the center of the far wall. It was cracked, the glass reflecting the dim light from the hallway in distorted, shattered pieces. "I'm warning you," the receptionist said, her voice barely a whisper now. "Once you've seen it, once you've been in this room, you'll never forget it. It changes you. It makes you see things, feel things, hear things." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but my curiosity was too strong now. I stepped closer to the mirror, my hand trembling as I reached for it. As soon as my fingers brushed against the glass, a shock of ice ran through my body. And then, as if on cue, the whispers returned, louder, more frantic now. I jerked my hand back, and the room seemed to grow colder. The mirror's surface rippled, as if something were moving beneath the glass. I couldn't look away. I was paralyzed, drawn into the distorted reflection of myself, my face twisted, stretched unnaturally. The whispers turned into voices, dozens of them all speaking at once. I could make out fragments, frightened words, pleas for help, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I stepped back, my heart racing in my chest, the sound of my breathing deafening in the otherwise silent room. The receptionist was gone. She had disappeared, leaving me alone in the darkness. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut in my face. The door slammed shut behind me with such force that it nearly knocked me off balance. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was racing, and my thoughts were a jumble of fear and disbelief. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with something I couldn't quite explain, like a presence, something unseen but undeniably there. I turned around, my mind in overdrive as I tried to focus on the mirror. The reflection that had twisted and shifted moments earlier was now still, its surface smooth once more, but there was something off. Something in the way it reflected the room that wasn't quite right. It felt like the mirror was waiting, like it was watching me, and my skin crawled under its gaze. I tried the door handle again, my hands shaking, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as though it had been sealed from the other side, as though whatever force had trapped me in this room was not going to let me leave. Panic began to claw at my chest, my breathing becoming shallow, faster, but I refused to give in to it. I had to keep my head. I had to find a way out. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting to every corner, but there was nothing. No furniture, no windows, just that damned mirror, standing in the center of the room like some dark, forbidden altar. The voices were growing louder now, coming from everywhere at once, filling my head with whispers and cries. But I couldn't focus on them. I couldn't let myself fall into that madness. I moved toward the mirror, drawn to it, unable to resist. As I approached, the room seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath forming in front of me in small puffs of vapor. The whispers turned to unintelligible sounds, a cacophony of distorted voices pressing in from all directions. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers grazing the surface of the mirror. The moment my skin made contact, the world around me seemed to shift. The mirror rippled as though it were liquid, the glass warping and distorting like a funhouse reflection. The room spun, the walls bending inward as if the very fabric of the space was being torn apart. My head spun, and for a moment, I thought I was going to lose consciousness. But then something changed, something darker. I was no longer alone. A shadow moved across the surface of the mirror, a figure emerging from the depths of the glass. It was tall and shapeless at first, like a mist or smoke, but then it began to take form. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it solidified, revealing a face that looked like mine. My breath caught in my throat. The reflection in the mirror was me, but not the me I knew. The face staring back at me was twisted in a grotesque, unnatural expression, eyes wide with an intense, inhuman fear. I could see my own reflection, yet it was not me. It was wrong. Its features were blurred, shifting in a way that made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The reflection in the mirror, this thing, was not just mimicking me. It was mocking me. It knew things about me, things no one else could know. As I backed away from the mirror, it followed, the figure inside the glass never breaking eye contact. The voices from earlier were louder now, coming from this reflection, but they weren't just whispers anymore. They were screams. "Save me," the figure said, its voice a distorted version of mine, choked and desperate. It raised its hand to the glass, as if trying to reach me. "Save me, or we both drown. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was my own, but twisted, like a nightmare version of myself begging for help. A part of me wanted to run, wanted to escape, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. My hands trembled as I stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then it spoke again. You have to choose. Me, or you. The reflection's voice was stronger now, almost mocking. I've been trapped here for so long, and if you don't help me, you'll join me. Forever. The air in the room grew thick with an oppressive weight, and I felt the walls closing in. The mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its surface rippling with dark, shadowy tendrils that reached out like claws. It was pulling me in, drawing me closer. My body refused to obey. I felt my legs move of their own accord, dragging me toward the mirror, as if something else was controlling me. I fought against it, but it was futile. My fingers grazed the glass again, and instantly I was overwhelmed by a rush of images, flashes of memories, not my own, but the twisted reflections of them. They were dark, filled with violence, loss, and pain. Images of people I had never met, but who felt so familiar. The figure in the mirror. It wasn't just trying to trap me. It was trying to consume me. It wanted to take my place in this world, to replace me and steal my life. Please, I begged, my voice barely a whisper. What are you? The reflection smiled, but it wasn't a smile that anyone should have. It was a grin filled with malice, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. I am everything you fear. I am the thing that never lets you escape. And now, you are mine. In that instant, everything went dark. The world seemed to collapse around me. The voices, the cold, the twisted figure in the mirror, everything vanished into nothingness. I was falling into a black void, surrounded by a silence so complete that it suffocated me. I awoke on the floor of the hotel room, gasping for air. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was drenched in sweat. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from my mind, but the room was still. Too still. The mirror was gone. In its place was just an ordinary, empty wall. I stood up shakily, my hands trembling as I looked around the room. My body felt heavy, like I had just woken from a nightmare. But was it a nightmare? I couldn't be sure. The fear still clung to me, lingering in my chest like a dark, suffocating cloud. And then I saw it. The door was open, wide open, as though someone had unlocked it. The hallway beyond was just as quiet as the room, the air heavy with the same coldness that had taken over me. I don't know how long I stood there, my back pressed against the door, heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts scattered like broken glass. The silence around me was almost suffocating, but my mind refused to stop racing. The figure in the mirror, the whispers, the coldness, it all felt so real. The feeling of being trapped in that room, unable to escape, was burned into my memory. I could still feel its presence, even though I was no longer in the room with the mirror. I could still sense the cold air, hear the distorted voices echoing in my head. But I couldn't stay there, trapped in the hallway, unsure of what to do next. My instincts were screaming at me to get out, to find some way to escape whatever force had been haunting that hotel room. I didn't know what it wanted from me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from finished. I slowly turned and made my way down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Every door I passed seemed to whisper, every corner seemed to hide something just out of reach. The hall stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and I found myself wondering if I was even still in the real world. Was the hallway an extension of that cursed room, an endless loop from which there was no return? I could feel the weight of the mirror's influence still pressing on me, like a dark shadow trailing me wherever I went. The thought of returning to that room was unbearable. I could still see the twisted reflection of myself in the mirror, hear the mocking words. I didn't want to go back, but I knew deep down that there was only one way to end this. I had to confront it. I had to find out what it wanted. I had no idea what time it was, but the hallway was still eerily silent. I reached the elevator, hesitated for a moment, and then pressed the button. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet hum, and I stepped inside, my stomach tight with dread. The feeling of being watched never left me, and the oppressive air seemed to follow me wherever I went. I pressed the button for the lobby, and as the elevator began to descend, I felt a strange sensation, as though the air itself was growing thicker. The lights flickered, and the elevator jolted slightly, like it had just lost its bearings. My hands gripped the metal railing tightly as the elevator continued its descent, the whirring of the machinery, the only sound filling the small, confined space. Suddenly, the elevator came to a jarring stop. The lights went out completely, leaving me in pitch-black darkness. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. Was this part of it? Was I trapped again? I fumbled for the emergency button, but my fingers shook so violently that I could barely make contact with the panel. In the dark, I heard it. A low, guttural noise, a groan that seemed to come from the very walls of the elevator. My heart thundered in my chest, and I instinctively stepped back, pressing myself against the corner as the noise grew louder. It was a sound I recognized, just like the distorted voices in the mirror. It was a scream, not a human scream. No, this was something darker, something inhuman, filled with terror and anger. I felt my skin prickle with fear as the scream echoed through the empty space around me, reverberating in my skull. The elevator's lights flickered back on, and I was momentarily blinded by the sudden brightness. But when my vision cleared, I could see that something was wrong. The reflection of myself in the metal door of the elevator was twisted, just like in the mirror. My eyes were wide with fear, and my expression was no longer mine. It was that same twisted mockery, the face of the figure that had haunted me. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like jelly, and I collapsed to the floor of the elevator, my mind screaming in panic. The door opened with a soft chime, and I was dragged from my panic-stricken stupor by the sudden movement. I stumbled out into the lobby, my legs unsteady, my breath shallow. I could feel it, the presence, still there, following me, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The lobby was empty, the soft glow of the lights casting long shadows across the marble floors. The receptionist's desk was unmanned, the place eerily silent. I took a step forward, then another, heading for the exit. The doors were just ahead, and the fresh night air outside seemed like the only thing that could offer me any relief. But just before I reached the doors, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate steps. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned, my breath catching in my throat. But there was no one there. The lobby remained empty, save for me. I shook my head, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of it all. I had to leave. I had to escape. The feeling of being pursued, of something close behind me, intensified, and I felt the walls closing in again. I ran. I didn't even look back. I pushed the door open, the cool night air rushing into my face as I stumbled outside. The streetlights were dim, casting long shadows across the empty street, but I didn't care about the emptiness outside. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that cursed hotel, from whatever had been haunting me in that room. I kept running, my breath ragged, my mind focused on the only goal I had, escape. I didn't know how long I ran for, or how far. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, when I could run no more, I collapsed onto the grass of a nearby park, my body shaking from exhaustion, from fear. My mind was a mess of questions, of unanswered mysteries, and I knew deep down that I hadn't left the nightmare behind. That hotel, that room, it wasn't over. And neither was I. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what had happened. But as I looked up at the streetlights, I saw something that froze my blood. The hotel. It was still standing, its silhouette dark against the night sky. But there was something wrong with it. The lights were on in the windows, flickering. Shadows moved behind the curtains, and I could almost make out figures, shapes that weren't quite human. It was as if the hotel was alive, watching me. And I knew in that moment that I hadn't escaped. Not really. The nightmare hadn't ended. It was still waiting for me, just around the corner. And I was never going to be free. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. The questions, the fear, they would haunt me for the rest of my life. But one thing was certain. The hotel had changed me. It had left its mark, something that would never fade. I would never forget that night, the darkness, the twisted reflections, and the feeling of being hunted by something I could never understand. And so, I walked away, not knowing if I would ever be free, or if I would ever be able to shake the feeling that it was still following me. But I had no choice. I had to move forward, knowing that some things, some dark, twisted things, were never meant to be understood. I spent the next few days in a haze. My body still carried the tremors of the nightmare I had escaped from, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see that twisted reflection staring back at me from the mirror. The image was burned into my memory, a constant reminder of the terror that had unfolded in that cursed hotel room. But what haunted me more than the images and the sounds was the feeling, the ever-present sense that I was being watched, followed, as though something was waiting for me to return. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just the trauma of the experience, that the mind could play tricks when it was pushed to its limits. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the terror I felt was just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. What happened in that hotel room was real, and whatever I had experienced, whatever had followed me, was not finished. I told myself I needed to move on, to put the whole ordeal behind me. But every night, when the darkness settled in, I would lie awake in bed, my eyes wide open, waiting for something I couldn't name. I thought I was being paranoid, but every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, would send my heart into overdrive. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel, that room, was still out there, that it was still connected to me, no matter how far I ran. It wasn't until a month later that I returned to the city where the hotel stood. I told myself I was doing it for closure. I had to know. I had to see if it was still the same place, if it had truly changed me, or if I had just let the events of that night consume me. As I stood in front of the hotel again, I could feel the weight of it. The air around the building seemed heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite explain. The windows were dark, but the same unsettling feeling washed over me. The same presence that had stalked me in the hallways, in the elevator, was here now, watching. I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I couldn't make myself cross that threshold again. But as I stood there, staring at the entrance, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a reflection in the window. A shape, a figure, standing just inside, watching me. I froze. My heart stopped for a second. It was just a shadow, just a trick of the light, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew it was the same presence that had followed me all those weeks. The same thing that had been waiting for me to return. I turned away quickly, not giving myself time to second guess. My feet carried me away from the building as fast as they could, my breathing shallow and rapid. But as I walked down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to follow me, just at the edge of my vision. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but I felt it. Something was watching. It wasn't until I reached the bus stop, far away from the hotel, that I finally allowed myself to breathe again. I stood there, trying to steady my hands, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I couldn't go back. I couldn't face it again. Whatever that hotel had done to me, whatever dark force had been unleashed, it was something I wasn't ready to confront. But as the bus pulled up and the doors opened, I saw something in the reflection of the window. A figure, a person, standing at the far end of the street, watching me. I turned quickly, heart racing, but there was no one there. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the feeling of being hunted, of being followed by something I couldn't explain. No matter how far I ran, it seemed to always be one step behind me, just out of reach. And as the bus carried me away from the city, away from the hotel, I realized that the nightmare wasn't over. It would never be over. That room, that mirror, it had left its mark on me in ways I couldn't fully understand. And I would carry it with me wherever I went. I don't know if it'll ever return to that place. I don't know if it'll ever be able to shake the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in a web of darkness that I can't escape. But one thing I do know, some things, some places, are never meant to be forgotten. And sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we can't outrun the things that haunt us. As I sat on the bus, watching the city fade into the distance, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens to those who never escape? What happens to those who are left behind, trapped in the shadow of something that should have never existed? I don't have the answers. I don't know if I'll ever find them. Our group consisted of 4 friends, all with their own personalities, quirks, and reasons for loving the outdoors. There was me, a quiet guy, always focused, often reserved, but also the one who kept the group organized and together. Then there was Mike, a natural-born leader. He had this infectious energy that could make anyone feel like anything was possible. Next was Rob, a calm and steady presence. He was the one who would quietly observe, always thinking, never too quick to jump into anything. Finally, there was Tina, a brave soul with an adventurous spirit. She was the one always suggesting the crazy trails or locations we'd visit, often dragging us into situations we never saw coming. That weekend, we planned a trip to a forest that, although local, none of us had really explored before. It was known for its dense trees and eerie quiet, a place that was often whispered about in town. Locals would talk about how you should never stay too long in those woods, and how people had gotten lost without a trace. But these were just stories, and we didn't believe in that kind of thing. After all, it was just a forest. On the morning of our trip, the weather was perfect. The sun was bright, and there was a cool breeze in the air. It felt like the ideal day for an adventure, the kind where nothing could go wrong. We packed our gear, a few days' worth of supplies, and set out on what was supposed to be a fun and relaxing hike. As we drove through the winding roads, the landscape gradually changed. The bustling town faded behind us, replaced by thick trees and shadows that seemed to stretch over the road. There was a strange stillness in the air, but we didn't think much of it. We were used to the quiet of nature. It was part of what made the outdoors so beautiful, the absence of the noise and chaos of city life. We arrived at the entrance to the forest, where a small, weathered sign stood, barely readable. I remember Mike jokingly reading it out loud, laughing at how faded it was, like it hadn't been updated in years. The trail was a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for us to walk side by side. The trees towered above us, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The further we walked in, the darker it seemed to get. At first, everything felt normal. The forest was dense, but it wasn't anything we hadn't seen before. The air was cool, and the sound of crunching leaves beneath our feet was the only noise breaking the silence. We laughed and joked as we made our way along the path, the kind of carefree conversation that fills a hike with lightness. Rob pointed out some unusual plants along the trail, while Tina joked about the birds in the trees. But as we ventured deeper, something started to feel off. It wasn't something you could pinpoint, but a sense of unease slowly began to settle in. We decided to make camp in a small clearing, far from the entrance. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and we wanted to settle in before it got too dark. Setting up our tents, lighting a small campfire, and sharing stories under the trees felt familiar, like any other camping trip. But as the night went on, there was something strange about the forest. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the woods were watching us. It was quiet, too quiet, but we shrugged it off. After all, we were in the middle of a forest, and the stillness was probably just a normal part of the natural world. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone out there. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I remember glancing up at the dark sky, the stars so far away, and wondering about the strange feeling that lingered. Maybe it was just the isolation, the lack of noise. Whatever it was enough to make me uneasy, but I didn't say anything. It's funny how you can know something's off, but not quite admit it. We spent the night in our tents, the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig outside our campfire's reach, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I tried to fall asleep, but every time I closed my eyes, something felt wrong. It was a restless night, filled with the usual sounds of the woods, but amplified, like the forest was somehow more alive than usual. We woke up the next morning to a thick mist that clung to the ground, swirling around the bases of the trees. The air was damp and cold, and for a moment, it felt like the world had been swallowed up by the fog. I could barely make out the shapes of my friends as they emerged from their tents, rubbing their eyes and stretching, still groggy from a restless night. It was a typical morning after a night of camping, quiet, still, and eerily calm. But something about this fog felt different. It wasn't like the usual morning mist we had encountered on other hikes. This was thick, almost suffocating, like it had been there for far longer than we realized. "Man, this fog is crazy," Mike said, his voice muffled by the mist as he walked over to the fire pit. "It wasn't here last night." "Yeah, it's almost like it just rolled in," Tina added, scanning the surroundings with a furrowed brow. "It's weird." Rob, always the level-headed one, simply nodded. "It's probably just a weather front or something. It'll pass." But even as Rob said that, I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't one to get spooked easily, but there was something in his expression that made me wonder if he was just as unsettled as the rest of us. He stood up and started to gather the camping gear, his movements deliberate and mechanical. We all seemed to be going through the motions of packing up, but there was a strange tension in the air. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As we packed, Tina kept glancing over her shoulder, a nervous twitch in her eye. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" she asked, her voice low, almost as if she was afraid to speak the words out loud. I didn't answer right away, but I couldn't deny the growing sense of discomfort. It felt like we were being observed, though the mist made it impossible to see very far. The woods, usually so peaceful and welcoming, now seemed oppressive and hostile. Every creaking branch and rustling leaf sounded too loud, too deliberate, like something was moving just out of sight. "Are you serious?" Mike scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. "There's nothing out there. It's just fog messing with your head." But even as Mike said it, I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow darting between the trees, too quick to be anything natural. I blinked, trying to focus, but when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe the mist playing tricks on my eyes. But I wasn't so sure anymore. We decided to head out, making our way down the narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The mist clung to everything, making the woods feel like a different place altogether. The trees, normally towering and majestic, now seemed to close in around us, their trunks appearing to twist and turn in the fog. The air was damp, and every step seemed to take us further from reality. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led somewhere, like the forest was guiding us, or maybe trapping us. As we walked, Tina spoke again, her voice more serious this time. "You guys hear that?" she asked, stopping in her tracks. "It sounds like footsteps." We all fell silent, straining to listen. For a moment, the only sound was the soft squelch of our boots in the wet dirt. But then I heard it too, faint, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking behind us, just out of sight. "Come on, there's no one else out here," Mike said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He too was beginning to feel it. "We're just being paranoid." But the footsteps continued. Steady, rhythmic, almost like they were following us. "Maybe it's a hiker," Rob suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone else on the trail." I glanced behind us, but there was nothing, just the fog. The feeling of being watched, though, was undeniable. I could feel my pulse quicken, and a chill crawled up my spine. My breath was shallow, my heart racing. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack, like a branch snapping under heavy weight. The noise was so sudden and so close, I nearly jumped out of my skin. We all froze, our eyes scanning the mist, but we couldn't see a thing. The fog had become so thick by now that it felt like we were walking through a wall of wet cotton. "All right, that's it," Mike said, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "Let's turn back." But as we began to retrace our steps, I noticed something strange. The trail didn't look the same. The trees seemed to have shifted, their positions altered in ways that didn't make sense. What had been an open path just moments ago now felt constricted, as if the forest was closing in on us. "Do you guys see that?" Tina asked, her voice trembling. She pointed ahead, and I followed her gaze, my eyes widening in disbelief. In the distance, barely visible through the mist, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal in appearance. I couldn't make out its features, but there was something about it that didn't belong. It wasn't human. It was wrong. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "We need to leave. Now." But as I turned to speak to my friends, I realized something even worse. They weren't standing beside me anymore. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. They had all vanished. "Mike? Rob? Tina?" I called out, panic rising in my chest. But no response came. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart and the soft rustling of the trees. I was alone. Then, from somewhere deep within the fog, I heard a voice. Low, grating, almost soothing. It whispered my name. "Get out of here," I muttered to myself, turning and running in the direction I thought we had come from. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the mist growing thicker with every step. The trees felt like they were reaching out to grab me, their branches curling and twisting like fingers. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and branches, not daring to stop. And then, through the haze, I saw something, the dim outline of a figure, standing at the edge of the trail. It was the same one from before, except this time, it was closer. The figure stood there, barely visible in the dense fog, its pale form almost blending with the mist. My breath hitched in my throat as I froze, my legs feeling like they were made of stone. My eyes locked onto the strange figure, which was now slowly walking towards me, its movement unnaturally smooth, as though it was gliding over the ground rather than walking. The closer it got, the more its outlines seemed to distort, as though it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. Every instinct in me screamed to turn and run, but my legs were frozen, my feet rooted to the ground. The air was thick, suffocating, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. It felt as if the forest itself was closing in, the trees standing so close together now that they almost blocked out the sky. I could barely hear the sound of my own breathing over the pounding in my chest, but I was aware that the figure was now only a few feet away. Then it stopped. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped somewhere deep inside me. The figure tilted its head, as though it was examining me, its presence heavy in the air, oppressive. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. They were hidden in the shadows of its face. Its body was elongated, limbs impossibly thin and long, yet the way it moved gave the illusion that it was somehow wrong, like it didn't belong. The air became thick, humid, and the trees seemed to groan with an eerie rhythm, their leaves shaking in a way that had no natural explanation. The atmosphere was saturated with an electric tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I finally managed to take a step back, and then another. My body moved before I could process what was happening, my brain screaming at me to move faster. I broke into a sprint, pushing past branches and brambles, not looking back. The fog swallowed me whole, and it felt as if the very ground beneath me was shifting, guiding me deeper into the woods. I didn't know where I was going. All sense of direction had vanished. The trail, which had once seemed clear, now twisted in impossible ways, like a labyrinth I couldn't escape from. The trees loomed over me, their trunks gnarled and twisted like ancient, forgotten things. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and there was something else, something sharp and metallic, like blood, hanging in the air. Suddenly, I tripped over something hard, sending me sprawling to the ground. I caught myself just in time, my hands scraping against the rough earth as I pushed myself up. That's when I saw it, a torn piece of fabric, like a shirt or a jacket, caught on a thorny bush. It was covered in dirt and wet with something that could have been rain or something else. I ripped it off the bush and held it up, inspecting it. It looked like it had been there for days, maybe weeks, but the fabric was fresh, still intact, not rotting, and certainly not weathered enough to belong to the forest. I could feel my pulse quicken as I realized what this meant. Someone else had been here, someone who might still be out here. A cold gust of wind blew through the trees, and I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the bark, slow, deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I froze. Slowly, I turned, scanning the forest behind me, expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Just the swirling mist and the endless sea of trees. I didn't want to look, but I had to. There was a compulsion to know what was behind me. So, slowly, I turned around, expecting nothing more than a thick veil of fog. But this time, the fog had parted just enough for me to see something. It was a clearing, a small one, just beyond the trees, with a circle of rocks in the center, like some sort of ritualistic altar. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped forward, my footfalls muffled by the soft, wet ground. At the edge of the clearing, something caught my eye. A figure, half hidden by the mist, standing with its back to me. I couldn't make out the details, but the shape was unmistakable. It was another one of those unnatural beings. The same long, twisted limbs, the same strange posture. But this one was different. It wasn't moving. It stood completely still, like a statue. I could feel my pulse racing, my mouth dry. I had to move. I had to leave. But as I turned, I realized the fog had thickened again, and the path back was gone. The trees seemed to have shifted while I wasn't paying attention, and I couldn't find the way out. My body was trembling with fear, but I knew I couldn't stay in the clearing. Not with that thing there. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around me. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was clear the voice wasn't human. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that shouldn't be here. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as the mist closed in around me. It was everywhere now, thick and choking, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I had to get out, but every direction I turned, the mist seemed to shift, guiding me deeper into the woods, away from safety. Then, as if the very forest itself was alive, I heard something else, a low, rhythmic thudding sound, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from behind me, from the darkness where I couldn't see. The sound was unmistakable, footsteps. Someone or something was following me. I didn't dare look back. I ran. I ran with everything I had, through the dense fog, the trees, and the feeling of being watched, pursued, hunted. My breath was ragged, my legs aching from the effort, but I couldn't stop. The cabin loomed before me, its wooden walls sagging under the weight of age and neglect. It looked like something out of a forgotten nightmare, barely standing, surrounded by the ever-thickening fog. My breath was coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled toward it, the sound of my heart hammering in my chest, louder than anything else. The footsteps were closer now, too close. I could feel their presence like a shadow pressing in on me, suffocating every thought. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The hinges creaked in protest, and a sudden gust of wind blew through, sending a chill down my spine. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust and mildew, but it was better than the alternative, the woods. Outside, the footsteps were still coming, a relentless drumbeat that threatened to consume me. I didn't know what I expected to find inside the cabin, but it certainly wasn't what I saw. The interior was dim, illuminated only by the faintest glimmer of light filtering through cracks in the rotting walls. The air was thick, like something had been stored here for far too long, something that didn't belong. The room was sparse, filled only with decaying furniture and broken objects. But in the center of it all, there was a large, intricately carved wooden chair, positioned directly in front of a cracked mirror. The chair was made of dark wood, the carvings twisted and contorted into grotesque shapes. It looked like it was meant to hold something or someone, but it didn't seem quite right. It felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped forward cautiously, each creaking floorboard beneath my feet sending a shiver down my spine. The mirror reflected the dim light, but as I approached, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just reflecting the room. It was reflecting me, but not entirely. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't quite mine. There was a difference, something subtle but unnerving. My face in the mirror seemed off. My eyes were too wide, too hollow, and my expression was frozen in an eerie smile, one that didn't match my own fear. I reached up to touch my face, and the reflection did the same, but the smile on the mirrored version of me grew wider. My stomach turned, the sight of my reflection now sending a wave of nausea through me. And then it spoke. It wasn't my voice. It was deeper, colder, almost a whisper, though the words were clear. You shouldn't have come here. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and that's when I noticed something else. There were symbols carved into the walls, strange, cryptic markings that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. They were glowing faintly, almost like they were alive, shifting and moving in the dim light. The air in the cabin was thick with an oppressive force, like the very building was filled with a presence, a consciousness that had been waiting for something or someone to arrive. Suddenly, I heard the door slam shut behind me, trapping me inside. The room grew colder, and I could feel the temperature drop rapidly. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts, the fog from outside swirling into the cabin, filling the space with an unnatural chill. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow brighter now, their shapes becoming more defined, more sinister. I turned back to the mirror, my reflection still smiling that twisted, unnatural smile. But now, it was more than just a reflection. It was moving on its own, as though it had its own life, its own will. The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand coming through the glass. I screamed, stumbling backward, but there was no escape. And then I saw it. A figure behind me, standing in the corner of the cabin. It was tall, too tall, with long, spindly limbs. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, dark and hollow, stared at me with a predatory intensity. It was the same thing I had seen in the forest, the creature that had been following me. It had been here all along, waiting for me to find the cabin. The mirror figure released its grip on me, and I stumbled forward, falling to the floor. The creature in the corner stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. It didn't need to hurry. I was already its prey. My body was frozen in terror, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs were like lead, and my body refused to obey. The creature came closer, and I could hear its breath now, shallow and ragged. It was too close. I could feel its cold presence, its essence crawling under my skin, into my very soul. But then, as if by some miracle, the door to the cabin burst open, and I heard voices, shouting, running footsteps. Someone was here. The creature froze, its eyes narrowing as it turned toward the doorway. Its face contorted in a snarl, its sharp teeth glinting in the dim light, but it didn't move. The voices grew louder, and I could hear the sound of hurried footsteps as more figures appeared in the doorway. People, real people, their faces determined and filled with purpose. The creature backed away, its body convulsing as if it was in pain, but it didn't attack. It seemed to be retreating, like it knew something I didn't. Its hollow eyes locked with mine one last time, and in that moment, I felt a deep, soul-chilling understanding. It wasn't done with me. It would be back. The people who had arrived rushed to my side, pulling me to my feet, but I could barely comprehend what was happening. My mind was a whirlwind, spinning with terror and confusion. The creature was gone, retreating into the shadows of the forest, but the feeling of its presence lingered, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I didn't know who these people were or how they knew to come for me, but they didn't offer any answers. They simply ushered me out of the cabin, away from the nightmare I had just lived through, and into the cold night. The fog had lifted, but the feeling of dread stayed with me, an invisible weight on my shoulders. The forest felt different now. The trees seemed to whisper, their branches bending and creaking as if they knew something I didn't. And the fog? It was still there, lingering just beyond the tree line, waiting for me to come back. The cold night air bit at my skin as I was led away from the cabin, my mind still reeling from the nightmare I had just endured. The forest stretched out before me, dark and foreboding, but the terror that had held me captive inside that decaying cabin was finally starting to fade, just a little. The figures who had arrived to pull me from the darkness weren't much for explanations. They didn't seem to care about my questions or my confusion. They were focused, urgent, and didn't look back at the cabin as they moved through the woods. They just kept urging me to move faster, as though the danger wasn't over. I stumbled alongside them, my thoughts a tangled mess. The creature, the reflection in the mirror, the whispers in the cabin, everything felt surreal. But the fear still gripped my chest, choking any thoughts of calm. I didn't dare ask the people guiding me through the woods who they were or how they knew I needed help. Their faces were hidden in the shadows, their movements too quick for me to properly get a glimpse. They weren't exactly comforting. They were efficient, like they had done this many times before. We didn't stop to rest, not even when we reached the edge of the forest. By the time we emerged into the open clearing, I felt like I had been walking for hours, my legs heavy and my mind foggy with exhaustion. The forest seemed endless, and yet the fear was still fresh in my mind. It hadn't dissipated with the distance we had put between us and the cabin. In fact, the farther we walked, the worse it seemed. The moment we stepped into the clearing, the The moonlight hit my eyes with an intensity that made me squint, but it didn't offer me the comfort I had hoped for. The clearing wasn't peaceful. It felt wrong. The air was thick, and the ground beneath my feet felt unnatural, as if something had been buried there, something that didn't want to stay hidden. The group of figures that had led me here finally stopped. I barely had time to catch my breath before they turned to face me, their expressions unreadable. There was no warmth in their faces, no comfort. They didn't seem human anymore. There was something detached about them, as though they had already seen too much to care. "We've taken you far enough," one of them spoke, his voice deep, almost robotic. "You're safe now. For now." I could feel the weight of his words. Safe for now. What did that even mean? I opened my mouth to ask, to beg for more answers, but before I could get a word out, they turned and disappeared into the woods. Just like that. They didn't offer any more information, no reassurances. The moonlight illuminated their retreating figures for just a moment, and then they were gone, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. I stood there, alone. The fog from the woods still clung to the edges of the clearing, swirling in the cold night air. I was safe, for now, but the unease in my chest refused to go away. I couldn't stay here. Not alone. Not with the unsettling feeling that something was waiting for me, something that hadn't left. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over. I couldn't forget the way the creature had looked at me, its eyes hollow and filled with malice. I couldn't forget the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't just some trick of the light. It was something that wanted me, something that had been waiting for me. I had to leave. I had to find some way to escape. But where could I go? The people who had helped me were gone. The forest was vast, and it didn't feel like it would let me leave that easily. The road was nowhere in sight, and the mountains in the distance loomed like silent sentinels. I had no choice. I started walking, each step feeling heavier than the last. The darkness seemed to press in on me, suffocating, and the longer I walked, the more I felt like something was tracking me. The sounds of the forest felt amplified, louder, the rustling of the trees and the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something off about it, like it wasn't just the wind. Suddenly, I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. There was a sound, a voice. But it wasn't a voice I could place. It was a whisper, distant but clear, a whisper that was close to me, yet not close enough to be real. It was as though it was coming from inside my head. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling me. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had to go back. I couldn't escape. Something had been left behind in that cabin. Whatever force had pulled me there, whatever entity had taken its twisted form in the reflection, it wasn't done with me. It had waited for me to make a move, and now that I had, it was coming for me. I turned, unable to fight the pull. It wasn't a rational decision. It was something deeper, something primal. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a trap, and I had walked right into it. The whispers grew louder as I retraced my steps back toward the cabin, each step heavier than the last. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my body refused to obey. When I reached the cabin once again, the door was slightly ajar, and the air inside was thick with an oppressive energy. It felt like it was waiting for me, like it had always been waiting for me. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the cabin, but I knew that I was no longer alone. The creature had returned. But this time, it wasn't just an apparition in the mirror. It had manifested into something real, something that reached out from the shadows to claim me. I don't remember much after I stepped back into the cabin. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the world outside seemed to vanish entirely. The air inside was thick, as if it had been waiting for me to return. My heartbeat echoed in my ears as I stood there in the middle of that decaying space, the flickering remnants of old light trying to push back the overwhelming darkness. At first, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. But I could feel it, the pressure on my chest, the way the walls seemed to close in. The whispers I had heard earlier grew louder, But this time they weren't distant. They were right next to me, swirling through the air like an unholy breeze. I was trapped. I knew it. Then, from the corner of my vision, I saw it. The reflection. It was no longer just a vague outline in the mirror. It was standing right there, just behind me. The air in the cabin grew colder, and the reflection, it wasn't mine. It had its own twisted expression, its eyes hollow and wide, its grin unnaturally wide. The thing in the mirror smiled at me, and I could hear it now. Its voice was like gravel scraping against stone. "You're ours now," it hissed. A chill ran through me as my body refused to move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my hands numb and trembling. The air felt suffocating, and I realized that whatever had been haunting this place, whatever had followed me from the depths of the forest, was now here in full force. I knew I had to act, but I couldn't. My thoughts were jumbled, tangled in a web of fear and confusion. The thing in the reflection reached toward me, its hand, or what I could only assume was a hand, stretching toward me from the dark, its fingers gnarled and elongated, like something out of a nightmare. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The reflection flickered, and the whole cabin seemed to breathe, deep, slow, and deliberate, as if it was alive. The walls creaked, the floor groaned beneath me, and I felt a pressure build up in my chest, like the weight of the world was closing in on me. I don't know what happened next. All I can remember is the moment the reflection disappeared. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was as if it had never been there to begin with. And with it, the air in the room seemed to lighten, just a little. But I didn't feel safe. Not at all. I ran. The door that had once seemed so distant was suddenly right in front of me, and I threw it open without hesitation, almost stumbling over myself in the process. The forest outside was silent, as if it had been waiting for me to make this choice. The trees, once looming and ominous, now felt strangely quiet. The only sound was my breath, harsh and ragged as I ran through the woods, not looking back, not daring to. I don't know how far I ran, how much time passed. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the landscape. The world around me felt like a dream, surreal and impossible to grasp. But there was one thing I couldn't shake, the sense that something was still watching me, still following me, even though I couldn't see it. When I finally emerged from the edge of the forest, I didn't feel any better. I had hoped for some sense of peace, for the terror to subside, but it hadn't. The shadows that had haunted the cabin seemed to have followed me, like an invisible force I couldn't escape. I never went back to that forest. I couldn't. The very thought of returning to that place, to the cabin, was enough to make my blood run cold. I tried to move on, tried to live my life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, something that was still out there, something that had been waiting for me all along. The building itself had a history, one that wasn't often talked about, but it was there. Some said it had been built on the site of an old asylum, Others whispered that it was built near an old cemetery. I had no real reason to believe these stories, but they were persistent rumors, passed along in hushed tones between the staff during breaks or while passing in the hallways. There were always odd things happening in the hospital that no one could explain, but they were chalked up to the typical wear and tear of an old facility. The hospital had seen better days, but there was still something about it that kept it alive. The constant hum of machines, the echoes of footsteps on the linoleum floors, the constant rush of people in and out, this was life at the hospital. It was a routine that became second nature to all of us who worked there. The nurses and doctors, the custodial staff, and even the security guards, everyone had their place, their role to play in the machine that kept this place running. I remember the nights especially well when the hospital would quiet down after the rush of patients and visitors would dwindle. That was when the place felt its most alive, but it wasn't a good kind of alive. It was as if the building had a pulse of its own, a quiet thrum in the walls, in the floors. The sounds of the night were different from the daytime noises, and for some reason, it always made me uneasy. The first time I truly became aware of the strange things happening in the hospital was a few months after I started working there. I was still getting to know the place, figuring out where everything was and who everyone was. It was an ordinary Wednesday evening, the kind where the patients were calm and everything seemed to be running smoothly. The hospital was split into different wings, each designated for different specialties: emergency care, intensive care, pediatric care, and so on. The wing I worked in was mostly for long-term care, with elderly patients who needed constant monitoring. I had just finished my rounds and was heading back to the break room when I noticed something unusual. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I didn't think much of it at first, attributing it to tiredness or perhaps just the odd creak of the old building. But as I walked down the long corridor, the flickering continued, lights dimming and brightening in quick succession. It wasn't the kind of malfunction you'd expect from old wiring. It was more deliberate, as though the building itself was trying to get my attention. When I reached the break room, I found the others talking, but there was something about their conversation that felt off. They were discussing something they'd heard earlier that day about an incident in the emergency room. A patient had come in, covered in blood, but no one could explain where the blood had come from. He had been unconscious when they found him, and though he had been in for a routine checkup, no one could find any evidence of an injury. I listened quietly, not sure what to make of it. The doctors had said it was probably just a freak accident, a broken fore or something, but the look in their eyes said otherwise. There was a nervous tension in the air that made me uncomfortable. They weren't talking about it like it was just another day at the hospital. They were talking about it like it was something more. Later that evening, as I was walking back to my station, I passed by the old chapel on the second floor. It was a place where staff could go to rest, pray, or just have a moment of peace away from the chaos of the hospital. But tonight, the door was ajar, something that never happened. The chapel was always locked after hours. I peered inside, the dim light from the hallway spilling into the room. I could see the faint outline of the pews, the faded stained glass windows, and the altar at the far end of the room. But what I saw next made my heart race. There, sitting at the altar, was a figure. A person hunched over as if they were praying. But the oddest thing about it was the way they sat, motionless, like a statue, not moving at all. I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hall, but the figure didn't respond. It was as though they didn't hear me. I stepped forward, but before I could get too close, the figure stood up and turned toward the door. It wasn't a person at all. It was a shadow, tall, thin, with a face that I couldn't see, but I could feel it watching me. The air grew cold around me as I took a step back, my body frozen in place, and then the shadow disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there, unsure of what I had just witnessed. I quickly left the chapel, my mind racing with questions. What had I seen? Was it a trick of the light? Had my mind just played a cruel joke on me, Or had something more sinister been lurking in that room? I wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. Something was not right in that hospital. As I walked back to my station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That the hospital, which had always felt like a safe place, now had a darker presence. It wasn't just the walls, the floors, or the machines. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was there. And from that moment on, I would never look at the hospital the same way again. The days following that strange encounter in the chapel felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened around the hospital. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed deeper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I tried to push it out of my mind. After all, hospitals were stressful places. Long hours, exhaustion, and an endless stream of patients could cause anyone to start seeing things. Maybe the chapel incident was just a trick of my tired eyes. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. It was a few days later when the first unsettling incident occurred. I had just finished my rounds and was making my way down to the morgue to check on a body that had arrived earlier in the day. I didn't think much of it. It was part of my job. The morgue was located in the basement of the hospital, a section of the building that was rarely visited except by those who had to go down there. The elevator ride down felt unusually long, the air growing colder with every floor. I could hear the hum of the lights overhead and the distant sounds of footsteps from the upper levels, but it felt strangely empty down here. The kind of emptiness that felt unnatural. As the elevator doors slid open with a soft metallic chime, I stepped out and into the dimly lit hallway. The morgue was just down the corridor, its door always unlocked, just the way it had always been. But as I approached, I noticed something odd. The door was wide open. It wasn't unusual for the door to be open if someone was in there working, but tonight, it was different. The lights inside the morgue were dimmer than usual, and there was an unsettling quietness to the place. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts telling me to turn back, but my training pushed me forward. I had a job to do. I stepped inside, the musty smell of the old building hitting me immediately. The first thing I noticed was the body. It was lying on the cold metal table, as expected. Nothing unusual there. But as I walked closer to inspect the body, something caught my eye. The sheet covering the corpse was slightly askew, not in the way it should have been after a proper covering. It looked shifted, as though someone had moved it recently. I brushed it off as just a mistake made by whoever had last worked here. But then, something else caught my attention. There, in the corner of the room, was a chair. It was sitting at an angle, facing the body, as though someone had been sitting there, watching. But there was no one in the room now. The chair had no business being there, and the strange thing was, it was too close to the table. No one ever sat that close to the body unless they were preparing to perform a procedure. I looked around again, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that made you feel like something was about to happen. I told myself it was nothing, just an oversight, and I was probably imagining things. But when I went to check the body, I noticed something even more disturbing. The sheet had a small, dark stain near the foot, something that looked like blood. But the thing was, the body was supposed to have been examined thoroughly when it arrived. The blood should have been cleaned off, the body prepped. So why was it still there? I quickly turned around, ready to leave the morgue. I felt a wave of unease settle in my chest, but before I could take a step, I heard it. A soft thud. I froze. It came from the back of the room, where the cold storage units were kept. The noise was faint, like something heavy had been dropped on the floor. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. The hairs on my neck were standing on end, and my heart was racing in my chest. I wasn't alone down here. Slowly, I took a step toward the back of the room, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to run. But I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. As I approached the cold storage units, I could see that one of them was slightly open. It was a small gap, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. My hand hovered over the door handle, and for a split second, I considered leaving. But something compelled me to open it. I pulled the door open with a creak, my breath shallow as I peered inside. To my shock, the body that had been placed there earlier in the day was missing. The slot was empty, the metal surface cold and untouched. But the bloodstains that had been on the body were still there, streaks of red staining the cold storage door. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. The body was gone, but the blood was still there, as if it had never been moved. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my mind spinning with confusion and dread. What was going on? Who had moved the body? How could this happen in a place like this? I rushed out of the morgue and back to the elevator, my heart pounding in my chest. The basement was too quiet, too strange. I needed to get out of there. As the elevator doors closed, I leaned against the wall, my hands trembling. I tried to make sense of what had just happened, but I couldn't. I couldn't explain it. And the strangest part? When I glanced back toward the morgue, I swore I saw a figure standing in the doorway, just a shadow, barely visible in the dim light. But it was enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Not at first. I didn't know how to explain it, or if anyone would believe me. After all, I was just a nurse's assistant, and these were the kind of things that people dismissed as imagination or stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was very wrong with this place. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, and I wasn't alone. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was just the stress of long hours, the exhaustion from working so many shifts in such a large, aged hospital. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something more was happening. It started small, subtle, a flickering light here, a strange noise there. It was easy to overlook at first, but the events grew more unsettling with each passing day. I remember the first time I heard it. I had just finished my shift and was heading down the hallway toward the break room to grab my bag. The halls were eerily quiet, the usual chatter and footsteps of nurses and doctors absent. But then, just as I passed by the old supply closet, I heard something. A soft scraping noise, like something or someone was moving just behind the door. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the scraping sound came again, followed by a low, guttural groan that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I told myself it was nothing, just some old equipment shifting, the building settling in the middle of the night. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly turned the corner, my heart pounding in my chest. The next night, I was working a late shift when it happened again. I had just finished assisting in the emergency room and was heading back to the office to file some paperwork when I passed by the same supply closet. This time, there was no scraping, no low groans, just an overwhelming cold that hit me like a wall as I walked past. It wasn't just the temperature change, it was the oppressive weight of it, like the air itself was thickening, pressing in on me. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the hallway, but it was empty. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the fluorescent lights above. I hurried to the office, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But when I sat down at my desk and tried to focus, I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to that cold spot in the hallway, the feeling that something was there, just out of sight, watching. The next incident was more dramatic. It was a few nights later when I was asked to help move a patient from one ward to another. The hospital had just undergone some renovations, and the older sections were notorious for their creaky floors and unpredictable electrical systems. As I wheeled the patient down the long corridor, I passed a row of old, unused rooms. They were shut tight, their doors old and rusted, their windows blackened with grime. As I approached one of the doors, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, followed by footsteps. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I glanced at the patient. He was oblivious, his head lolling to one side, unaware of the strange happenings around us. A figure standing still. Its shape was blurry, distorted, as if the darkness itself had taken form. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped back quickly, but then the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I didn't stick around to investigate. I rushed the patient to his new room, barely able to keep my hands from shaking. When I passed the same spot again, a few hours later, the door was locked, just as it should be. I wasn't the only one who was starting to notice the strange occurrences. As the days passed, other staff members began mentioning odd things happening in the hospital. A nurse reported hearing a child's laughter echoing down the hall late at night, despite there being no children admitted. Another nurse swore she saw a figure in the window of one of the upper floors, watching the courtyard below, but when she checked the building, there was no one there. The strangest part, no one seemed to be alarmed by it. The hospital was old, and strange things were bound to happen in a building as ancient as this one. But as I listened to their stories, my unease deepened. It wasn't just coincidence. There was something in that building, something I couldn't explain. One evening, during a particularly long shift, I decided to confront my fears head on. I made my way to the old chapel at the back of the hospital, the place where I had seen that strange light flicker days earlier. It was quiet now, with only the faint sound of my footsteps on the wooden floors breaking the stillness. The room felt cold as I stepped inside, the air heavy and damp with age. The flickering candle was still there, sitting on the altar, though it was much dimmer than I remembered. I walked closer, inspecting the room. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of old incense, and the light from the candle flickered against the stone walls, casting strange shadows that danced across the floor. As I approached the altar, I could hear something faint, like a whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but it was clear that it wasn't my imagination. I turned my head sharply, but the room was empty, save for the flickering candle and the cold stone walls. And yet, the whispering continued, growing louder. It was as if the very walls of the chapel were alive, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. Then, as if in response to my fear, the candle went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. I could feel the presence of something in the room with me. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a certainty. Something was there. The tension had been building for weeks now, and with every passing day, it felt like the walls of the hospital were closing in on me. I had become obsessed, consumed by the strange occurrences. I had seen the dark shapes in the corners of rooms, heard the whispers in the halls, and felt the unmistakable presence of something otherworldly lurking just beyond my sight. But nothing could have prepared me for what was coming. One night, I was alone in the hospital. It was late, well past midnight, and I had volunteered to stay behind and finish some paperwork. I wasn't scheduled to work the next shift, but something had been bothering me all day, a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. The feeling had intensified, and despite my exhaustion, I couldn't leave. Something told me I had to stay. Something told me that tonight would be the night when everything would make sense. But tonight, I couldn't ignore it. I needed to know. With a deep breath, I approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand hovered over the handle, and for a brief moment, I hesitated. But then, something inside me snapped. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was as dark as I remembered. The heavy curtains were still drawn, blocking out any trace of natural light. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. But something else was there now, something I couldn't explain. The temperature had dropped drastically, and I could see my breath in the air. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. My heart raced, and I couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I turned slowly, scanning the room for any sign of movement, but everything was still. The shadows seemed to shift, twisting and warping in the corners of my vision. In the far corner of the room, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It wasn't fully formed, its edges blurred and indistinct, but there was no mistaking the shape. It was tall, almost impossibly so, and its presence was suffocating. The air around it felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't understand. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. My mind had to be playing tricks on me. After all, I had been working long hours, and the stress was starting to take its toll. But then the figure moved. Slowly, it turned its head toward me, and I felt a chill shoot up my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step toward me, and with each movement, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey me. It was like they were rooted to the spot. The figure moved closer, its form becoming clearer with every step, and the air around it thickened, as if the very atmosphere was bending to its will. "You shouldn't have come." The words were impossible to ignore. They vibrated through my bones, a voice that wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a force that pushed against my will. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. I was paralyzed, my body trapped in the grip of whatever this thing was. I could feel its eyes on me, burning through me, piercing deep into my soul. My mind raced, thoughts scrambling in every direction. Who or what was this? What did it want from me? Why was it here? The answers were just beyond my reach, tantalizingly close, but obscured by the thick, suffocating fear that gripped me. The figure took another step, and this time I could hear the sound of its footfall, a faint scraping, like nails on stone. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, and for the first time I saw them clearly. Cold, empty eyes, voids that swallowed everything around them. My heart pounded in my chest, my body shaking uncontrollably. I tried to back away again, but this time I could feel something pulling me, something invisible but powerful, tugging me toward the figure. The walls of the room seemed to close in around me, the air thickening, as though the space itself was warping and distorting. "No," I gasped, the word barely escaping my lips. "Please." I don't want to." And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The figure vanished. The temperature returned to normal, and the room, which had felt so alive with dread just moments before, was now silent and still. I stood there, panting, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. I could still feel the coldness on my skin, the memory of its touch, but the figure was gone. The next few minutes were a blur. I stumbled down the corridor, my heart still racing, my mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. The figure had vanished, but its presence lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. My skin still felt the coldness of its touch, and every creak of the hospital building seemed amplified, each echo reminding me of the horror I had just witnessed. I couldn't breathe properly, my chest felt tight, and the world around me spun, as though the very fabric of reality had been ripped apart and reassembled. I made it to the elevator, my fingers trembling as I pressed the button to call it. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of that place. But even as the doors slid open with a soft chime, I hesitated. Was it over? Was I really safe? The thought of returning to the comfort of my apartment crossed my mind, but the fear that gripped me was stronger than my desire for safety. I needed to know. I had to know what had happened, what was going on in that hospital, and why it was happening to me. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, I felt the weight of the silence around me. The quiet was deafening, a constant reminder of the isolation I felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The elevator ride felt like it took an eternity. The floors ticked by, the numbers glowing above me, each one more terrifying than the last. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I stepped out with an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The lobby was empty. No one was there. No security guards, no nurses, no patients. It was as though the entire building had been abandoned in the span of a few minutes. I walked quickly to the exit, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The air outside was cool and refreshing, but I didn't feel any better. I had just seen something I couldn't explain, something that was beyond my understanding. I could feel the weight of it pressing on my chest, like a dark cloud that would never dissipate. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. The logical part of my brain tried to tell me that I was just tired, that it had all been a hallucination. But the rest of me knew better. That thing, that shadow, whatever it was, it had been real. And it wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't go back to the hospital. Not right now. Not after what it experienced. I needed to take some time to figure things out, to try and make sense of what had happened. The days that followed were filled with questions. I reached out to my colleagues, asking if anyone had noticed anything strange happening in the building. Most of them dismissed it, chalking it up to the stress of working in a hospital, but there was one nurse, Lisa, who seemed to understand. She pulled me aside one afternoon, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sympathy. "You're not the first," she said quietly, glancing around as though to make sure no one else was listening. "There's something wrong with that place. It's been happening for years. People have seen things, heard things. They say the hospital was built on land that's cursed. No one talks about it, but some of us know. And we've learned to keep our distance." My mind raced as she spoke, trying to process her words. Cursed? Was it possible? I didn't know, but part of me knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had been pulling me back to the hospital, something that wanted answers, something that wasn't ready to let me go. That night, I returned. I couldn't stay away. I had to find out the truth. But when I entered the building, it was different. The air was thick with tension, as if the very building was holding its breath. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that danced and twisted in the corners of the hallways. It was as though the hospital itself was alive, aware of my presence. I made my way to the old supply closet, the one where I had first heard the strange noises. The door was closed now, but I could feel the energy within, a pull that was undeniable. As I reached for the handle, the door creaked open by itself, as though inviting me in. I stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had been before, but this time there was no feeling of isolation, no presence lurking in the corners. It was empty, silent. I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, as though whatever had been there, whatever had haunted the hospital, was finally gone. But as I turned to leave, I felt something. A shift in the air, a disturbance. And in the reflection of the dark window, I saw it again. The figure. It was standing in the doorway, its eyes gleaming with that cold, empty void. But this time, it didn't move. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding. The figure was waiting for something. It was waiting for me to leave. And so, I did. I ran. As fast as I could, I ran from that place, leaving behind the unanswered questions, the lingering fear, and the knowledge that I might never truly escape. The days after I left the hospital were a blur. I tried to carry on with my life, as though nothing had changed, as though nothing I had witnessed had any real weight. But it wasn't that simple. The memories, the haunting presence, the feeling that something was still watching me, it never left. It clung to me, lingering at the edge of my thoughts like a shadow that refused to fade. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? The logical part of my mind tried to convince me that it was all just a series of coincidences, the product of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had encountered in that hospital was real, and it wasn't over. I went on with my routine, trying to push the memories to the back of my mind. I went to work, I hung out with friends, I did everything I could to pretend that nothing had changed. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the past caught up with me. One night, a few weeks after I had left the hospital for good, I woke up in the middle of the night. I was sweating, my heart racing. The room was dark, and for a moment, I thought I had dreamed the whole thing. But then I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps outside my door. Soft, deliberate, as though someone was walking slowly through my apartment. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the footsteps grew louder, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got out of bed, my legs shaky as I crept toward the door. My hand hovered over the handle, my breath caught in my throat. I told myself I was being irrational, that it was just the wind or the building settling. But I knew better. I opened the door. Nothing. The hallway outside my apartment was empty, silent, but there was something different. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in around me. I stepped back inside, the feeling of dread creeping over me again. I slammed the door shut and locked it, as if that would somehow keep whatever was out there from getting in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What had happened in that hospital? What was the thing I had seen? I had thought that by leaving, I would escape, but I was wrong. The nightmare had followed me. It wasn't confined to those walls. It was in me now, a part of me that I couldn't shake. The next day, I called Lisa, the nurse who had spoken to me about the hospital's dark past. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear, waiting for something to happen. She didn't answer at first. But then, after several attempts, she picked up the phone. "I knew you'd call," she said softly. Her voice was filled with a sadness I hadn't heard before. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." She explained that she had seen it all before. Colleagues, patients, even visitors to the hospital who had experienced the same strange occurrences. No one talked about it, but those who worked there had seen things, heard things, felt things that no one could explain. She told me that the hospital was built on land that had been the site of a terrible fire many years ago, a fire that had claimed the lives of dozens of people. Some believed the souls of the victims had never truly left, that they haunted the halls, waiting for something. "Some of us think it's connected to the building itself," she said. "It's not just the ghosts of the dead, it's something else, something older." I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure I could handle the truth, but I needed to know. I had to know what had really happened, why this was happening to me. The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. I tried to reach out to others who had worked at the hospital, but no one wanted to talk about it. They either denied everything or gave me vague, unsettling answers that only fueled my growing sense of unease. I couldn't keep running from this. The presence, the feeling of being watched, it was too much. I had to face it. I returned to the hospital one last time. The building stood in front of me, imposing and silent. It looked so normal, so innocuous in the daylight. But I knew what lay inside. I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, the stories of death and suffering that had become woven into the very walls of the building. I walked through the front doors, and the familiar smell of antiseptic and dust hit me. The halls were eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It was as though the hospital had become a place trapped in time, a place where the past and present collided. I walked through the same corridors, retracing the steps I had taken months ago. The further I went, the more the air grew heavy. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The silence was deafening. The fear, the dread, it was all so familiar. Finally, I reached the supply closet. The door was slightly ajar, just like it had been that night when I first encountered the figure. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was empty. For a moment, I stood there, unsure of what to do next. The building was quiet, as if holding its breath. There was no sign of the figure, no shadow watching me from the corner. But I knew better than to think it was over. It wasn't over. It never would be. I turned and left, walking out of the hospital one final time. I didn't know what had happened to me, or why I had been the one to experience it, but I knew I could never come back. The past, with all its ghosts and unanswered questions, had claimed its hold on me, and there was no escaping it. As I walked away, I looked back one last time at the hospital. The windows were dark, but I could have sworn I saw something move in the reflection,